This is going to be a massive project. Not only am I going to show you how to create this Twitter clone, which includes everything you would want, such as authentication, creating tweets, liking tweets, following people, different feeds, and so on, but also I'm going to show you how you can actually deploy this in a production-ready way so that people can start using it immediately. If you want to build out a robust backend API that supports things like REST, GraphQL, authentication, and so much more, but you don't want to go through the monotony of writing out a bunch of really boring boilerplate code, then look no further than today's video sponsor, Application. As you can see, they make it incredibly easy to get started with a backend API. You just click a few buttons to select what you want, and it's going to generate all of the code for you to set up a full backend API with an admin dashboard, and it uses all of the technologies that I really love, such as Prisma, Jest, React, and so on, which is really great. Best of all, Application is completely open source, which I love, and also the code that it generates for you is really easy to read and understand, so you can always go ahead and make changes to the actual generated code. But the thing that really sets Application apart is that they make it incredibly easy to modify your code inside of their actual UI, so you can go ahead and add relations to your data and anything else that you want to be able to query on your data inside of the API, and it's all incredibly easy and it's all integrated perfectly with GitHub, so it works just like your normal code workflow. So this is just a superpower essentially that you can use to make writing out some of these boilerplate codes so much easier. If this sounds interesting to you, I'm going to have a link in the description to Application. You can get started completely for free. They have a great free tier, so I highly recommend checking that out. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And to get started with this Twitter clone, we're actually going to be using something called the T3 stack. This is essentially built on top of Next.js, and really all the T3 stack does is it combines together different technologies into Next.js. So you have Next.js, which is the main thing. You have TypeScript, so everything's going to be type safe. We have Prisma for handling all of our database related needs, and TRPC is going to be used for handling all of our different needs for communicating between the client and the back end. We also have NextAuth for authentication, so it pretty much includes everything you need out of the box to create a type-saved application. So to get started, we can just copy this command, bring it over to our terminal, and run npm create t3-app at latest. So we can just run that real quick, and it's going to ask us a few things to get started with. So let me just make this a little bit larger so you can see. First of all, we need to install the latest version, so let's do that real quick. And then after that, all we need to do is just answer some questions. So what is our project going to be called? I'm going to put a period because I want to create it in the current folder, but you can put whatever your project is. We're going to be using TypeScript, and here we can toggle what we want. In our case, I want to use everything. So Tailwind is the other kind of main thing that T3 has inside of it, which I really love. So we're going to toggle all of these, hit enter. And then of course I want to initialize a Git repository. So we'll just say yes. Would I like to write npm install? Yep. And then my import alias, I'll just leave it as the default. So this is just going to go ahead, install everything, create all the boilerplate for us. And you'll notice that there's a lot of stuff that this actually creates for us. I'll go through all the stuff that you really need to understand about it as we go through this tutorial, but understanding what every single file does is not super important. Now that that is finished running, you'll notice that there's two steps we need to do. We need to first push our database, and then we need to run some dev command here to actually get it up and started. Now, the very first thing that you'll notice, if we go into this Prisma folder, this is where our database stuff is defined. And we open this up, you'll notice that the provider here is SQLite. This is fine for developing locally at the beginning, but really you want to use a more robust database for your actual development, especially when you post to production. And in our case, what we're going to be using is we're going to be using something called PlanetScale. If you've seen some videos by Theo, he talks a lot about this. Essentially, it's a really easy to use database that you can host online. You can also host your own locally if you want, but since we're going to be dealing with production as well, I just wanted to host everything in the exact same place. So what I'm going to do to get started, you'll notice I currently have a database here. That's what I was using for testing. I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this. So I'm just going to go into the settings. I'm going to completely remove this, delete this database. Yes, let's delete T3 dev. There we go. And now what I want to do is I want to create a brand new database. So we're just going to come down here to create a database, and we're just going to call this Twitter clone. And then for the region, I'm going to be using the US East. That's relatively close to where I live, so it'll be the fastest for this tutorial. And it's also close to where we're going to be hosting our actual Next.js application, which is really important. So we'll click Create Database here. And now we have a database up and running. And the really nice thing about PlanetScale, I'll just make this full screen real quick for you, is that it has something called branches. So we can have a production and a development branch that we can both have running on the same place. So it's really easy to do production and development. So for example, I have this main branch here, and what I want to do is I want to create a brand new branch off of that main branch. But first we have to wait for this to initialize, so I'll come back to you when that's done. There we go, that just finished. And what I want to do right here is I want to promote this to a production branch. Essentially what I'm saying is that this is going to be our production server branch right here, and then I'm going to create a branch off of that that's going to be for development. So I'm going to come into here, I'm going to create a brand new branch. I'm going to call this one dev, and I'm going to base it off of our main branch, host it in the exact same region, click create. And now if I go back here, you'll notice we have two branches. We have this dev branch right here and the main branch. The main branch is going to be our production branch where we're actually running our production server, and dev is going to be where we do all of our development. And the nice thing is since this is branches, it works just like Git, where I can essentially create a deploy request, which is like a pull request, to make my changes from my dev environment here to my production environment. So if I make database changes, I can push those to production really easily. So if we go back into dev here, we need to wait for this to initialize, and I'll get back with you when that's done. There we go, that just finished. And what we can do is we can come over here and click on connect. If we open this up, it's going to say that we can connect using different things. As you can see here, we have Prisma is the option that's being chosen by default, but there's a ton of different options. And I want to connect with Prisma, so I'm just going to click the copy button to copy over this database URL. And this needs to go in our environment variables file. So if we come in here, you're going to notice our database URL. We're just going to completely replace that. Now you will notice that this has password and username information inside of it. So right here, you can see that I have like a password. You do not want to expose this data anywhere, because if someone has access to this, they have access to your database, which is definitely not a good thing. So make sure that this is always hidden in some type of environment variable so it's not exposed to other people, because if they have this again, they can directly access your database. I'm going to be completely deleting this database when I'm done with this tutorial, so you won't be able to access this, password information here, but just make sure you don't expose this anywhere. And if you do, you have to reset it. So with that done, we can go over to the schema section. I'm going to copy this as well and bring it into my schema here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to paste this down. And you'll notice this gives us a client and it gives us a DB right here. And down here, you'll notice we have a client. We can just replace this, and same with this DB. The only thing is here, it says when using PostSQL or MySQL, which in our case, we're using MySQL, make sure that you uncomment the @db text annotations. So I'll show you exactly what that means. We'll just get rid of all of this real quick. We'll scroll down a ways and you'll see right here, these sections that have @db text. Just make sure that these are uncommented like that. And now if we give this a quick save, that should hopefully fix those problems. Now you did notice if we scroll down a little ways and we hover over this, you're seeing that here it says with relation mode equal to Prisma, no foreign keys are used, so relation fields would not benefit from the index. Essentially it's saying it can't create an index for you and you need to manually create an index. That's just because of the way that PlanetScale works. So what we can do is we can actually create our index for that. So if I make this a little bit larger, so you can see this is for our user field. So I can just say @index, and this index is going to be for my user ID. And I want to make sure this is a double ampersand like that. Indexes are just a way to make it so you can easily query data in an efficient way. So I'm just adding an index to this. And if we scroll down, you're going to notice we get the exact same thing here for this user. So I'm going to create the exact same index right there. And that should hopefully clean up all of those different warnings for us. So now if we give this a quick save, we should be able to run npx prisma db push, and that'll actually push all of these database changes that come by default for things like an account and so on. It's going to push it to our database over here on PlanetScale. And if we just give this a quick refresh here, we may have to refresh our entire page. You can see it says the schema diff is being generated. Let's just give it a quick second, but hopefully it should actually show us information. There we go. It's saying that all of these changes essentially are the difference between our development branch and our main production branch. So you can see here, we have all of this, SQL here for creating all of these different tables. So now we've essentially taken this entire Prisma schema, which is our entire database, and we've pushed it up to this development branch so we can start using and accessing it, which is great. Now also, if you're not familiar with some of the technology in this stack, for example, Prisma, I have an entire crash course covering Prisma. I'll link in the cards and description for you. It's a rather long video, but it covers everything you need to know about Prisma, so I highly recommend checking it out. Now with that done, we should hopefully be able to run our actual application. So if we say npm run dev, that should hopefully start up our application and we can see if everything is working. So let's open that up real quick. Give it a quick second to load, and hopefully it's not going to give us any errors, and it's just going to show up all of the information for all the default stuff, which is inside of this source folder here. As you can see, we have it showing up here. It's loading our information, hello from TRPC, and then we can click sign in to sign in with Discord. Now currently this is not going to work because if we look at our environment variables, you'll notice we don't have all of our environment variables filled in. So we need to finish doing that. But of course, that's the next step here. So in order to hook up Discord, you need to go over to discord.com/developers/applications. If you just search for Discord dev applications, it should bring you to here. And now you have the ability to create a new application. We're going to essentially need to create two applications, one for development, one for production. So we're just going to do the development one for now. So we can come up here and we can name whatever this want. So we'll call this Twitter clone, and we're going to make sure that this is for development only. So we'll say dev, and we can click create. Now we don't really need to do anything with this other than go over to this OAuth 2 tab. This has our client ID, which we can copy and paste into our secrets file here. And then it has our client secret, which we can just regenerate. And if I just enter my two-factor authentication code, you can see we have a client secret here that we can use and we can paste into here. Again, this secret code is something you should never share. I'm going to be deleting all this after this video goes live, so you won't be able to use any of it. Just make sure you don't ever share this with anyone. And if it does get exposed, just click the reset button and create a brand new one. So that is all we need to do for the Discord client ID and secret. So hopefully everything should be working for the actual authentication portion. And if we click sign in, you can see that it is going to somewhat work, but we have one last thing we need to do, and that is add a redirect. And that's because whenever we're dealing with authentication, we need to be able to redirect the user back to the page that is our application. That's the way OAuth works. So we need to actually tell them what that redirect URL is going to be. So the best thing we can do is if we go back to the documentation for T3, there's a section on Next.auth, and you'll notice it has setting up the default Discord provider, which is what we're using. We already got the client ID and the client secret set up. All we need to do is add the redirect. So what we can do is we can just copy this URL essentially. So I'm just going to copy this URL right here. And that's the URL that we're going to be using. And I'm just going to paste that right here into our redirects. And we'll click that is going to be added. So we'll click save. And now we actually have that redirect set up. So now what we can do is we're just going to reset our server real quick to make sure that all of the different environment changes that we made actually go through. I'm just going to go to our default page right here, localhost 3000. I'm going to click sign in with Discord. And hopefully this will bring us to a page right here. It's saying that I want to be able to access Discord with my Discord user. I'll click authorize. Give it a quick second, and hopefully it's going to create an account for me. And as you can see, I'm logged in as Web Dev Simplified, and I can see this secret message because now I'm logged in. Now that is great. There is one thing you'll notice. If we just scroll up here a little ways inside of our console, we're going to get this warning that says Next.auth warn no secret. Essentially, we don't have a secret right here. This is really easy to fix. We can just copy this line right here to generate a random set of characters. You can see that that's a random set of characters. We can just paste that in as our secret and uncomment that line. And now we have a secret generated, which is just going to be a little bit safer. Again, if this gets exposed, you're going to have to regenerate it again, just keep anything secret, which is why it's in these env variable files that don't get committed. So now with that done, we essentially have everything we need to do to get set up with authentication and our database. The next thing I want to do is actually deploy this right away so that we can really easily get it deployed and we can test what it's going to look like in production as well as in development. So the very first thing that you need to do to actually get this deployed is to go to GitHub and create a brand new repository like this. Go through, make it public, whatever you want to do, and then click create repository. I have a simple command set up that allows me to do this automatically. It's called init video repo. I create a ton of GitHub repositories for my videos. So this just essentially goes through, creates a repository for me, pushes all my code to it and gives me a license as well as a URL. So if I open this up, I now have a brand new GitHub repository with all of the code that we have inside of it. So super straightforward, and it also generates a license for me. But for you, you can just go ahead, create a GitHub repository, copy the code that it tells you to use, paste it into your console, and you can have all your code pushed up to here rather simply. From here, we can go to Vercel, and this is where we can actually create our application. You can see here, I have the test version right here. So let's just add a brand new project to get this working, and we're going to import a Git repository. Now, the way I have my GitHub set up is I only give Vercel access to specific repositories. So if I adjust my permissions, what I can do is come into here, make sure I give it my password and everything, and then I can scroll down to wherever the permission section is, and I can select a specific repository, which in our case is our Twitter clone. I'm just going to use that one, click save, and now it has access to that repository as well. So now we can just click import. You can see we have Twitter clone here. All of the build information should essentially be the default, but we need to set some environment variables for things like our database, as well as things like our secret, our next auth URL, our client ID, and this secret here. So the very first thing that we can do is we can go ahead and get our database URL. So if we go back over to PlanetScale, go to our branches, you'll notice we have our production branch. We can come into here, click connect, and now we have a URL here for our database URL that is for our actual production database. So we're just going to click copy on that, sorry. Come over to here, paste that down, and you can see it has created that right there for us. The next one we have is going to be for our next auth secret. I'm just going to generate a brand new secret using that same command. This is going to be a new secret that is only used in production. There we go. Let's add that along. Next thing we have is our next auth URL. The next auth URL is whatever the URL of our application is. Right now, we don't know what that is because I don't have a custom domain, so we'll leave that blank for now. Next, we need our Discord client ID. So if we go over to Discord, we just want to create a brand new application. So we can come back to our applications, create a new one. I'm going to call this Twitter clone, and this one is going to be for production. And we just go through the exact same steps we did for the development one. Come over to the OAuth section, copy over our client ID, and we'll paste that down as our value. Then we're going to do our client secret, and we're going to come back over to Discord again. There it is. Reset our secret, make sure we enter in that two-factor authentication code, click submit, and then we're just going to copy that over as well. And again, make sure you don't expose any of this information. Now with that done, we should have everything we need to done to click deploy here. It's going to take a little while, but it's actually going to deploy our application. And then once it's done deploying, what we can do is we can actually take that URL that we get generated as our automatic URL, and we can use that URL not only in our Discord redirect here, but we can also use it inside of our environment variables for the next auth URL as well. So once that's done, I'll come back and show you. There we go. We can click continue to dashboard here, and that should give us our URL. So if we just click visit, you can see we have our URL up here. I'm just going to copy this URL, and this is what we're going to use as our environment variable. So we just need to make sure we go to the settings. We need to go to the environment variables tab, and for our next auth underscore URL, we're just going to paste in that value as well. Now we can click save on that. Go over to Discord, we need to do the exact same thing, and we need to make sure we include all the additional information on the end of it. So if we just go back to the docs, you can see that that is, let's just copy this real quick. There we go, paste it down and get rid of all the stuff at the beginning. There we go, it's just /API/auth/callback/Discord, and click save. And now hopefully everything is also working on our production version. So here's our local version, here's our production version. Let's give it a quick refresh, click sign in and see if this works. We'll sign in with Discord. We'll click authorize, and if everything works well, it looks like we have an error of some form. The reason for this error is because we haven't actually pushed up our production database. Right now, we just have our database completely blank right now. So what we want to do is we're going to turn on this thing called safe migrations. You can see safe migrations not enabled. We're just going to enable that real quick, and that allows us to really easily migrate from our development branch to our actual production branch. So if we go back to all of our branches, I'll full screen this again. We can click on development here, and you can see all these changes that we have in our development. We want to also push to our production. I'm going to click create deploy request. And what that's going to do is create this request. You can see it looks a lot like a pull request, and it'll allow us to actually deploy these changes. So I can just click deploy changes. And what that's going to do is it's going to deploy all these changes to our production database. Once that's done, our actual authentication should work, because the reason it was failing is because we didn't have any tables in our database. So obviously it couldn't save our information. And there we go, the deployment just finished. So hopefully now if we go back to here and we try to sign in with Discord, our database will actually have tables inside of it. And there we go, it can save the user in the database, and you can see just how quick everything is. And the reason everything is so quick is our database is deployed on US East. And inside of here, our functions, if we go to the functions, you can see by default, they are also deployed on the East Coast of the US. So our actual functions, which access our database, are as close together as possible, which is really what you want. If I were to move these to somewhere else, for example, I deployed my functions all the way in Singapore, it's going to be much, much slower because now my database is on the other side of the world from where my actual application is running. Now with all of that done, we can essentially close out of everything because we now have our production environment set up as well as our development environment set up, and it's going to be very easy for us to push changes from development to production whenever we want to. I'm going to close out of pretty much everything except for I'm going to leave open our development server here, as well as our database for changing those changes, and then Vercel so we can actually check our deployed changes. Now, the very first thing that I want to do is I want to set up our schema for our entire database so we just have everything done that we need. First of all, we don't need this example table. This is just for example purposes. What we want to do is we want to create the different models for the tables that we're going to have. So in our case, we're going to have an ability to create a tweet, and another model is going to be the ability to create a like. So it's coming here for a like as well. Now a tweet obviously needs to have some type of ID. So we're going to give it an ID. And in our case, I'm going to be using a UUID. So we're going to set the default to UUID, which is why I gave this a column type of string here. Next, we're going to need to have a user ID for someone that actually creates this. And that's going to be a string, because if we go down here to our user, you can see that they're using strings for the IDs as well. Then what we can do is we can go ahead and put some content inside of here. That's going to be a string for whatever our content is. Our created at here is going to be a date time, and that is going to default to whatever the current time is. And I normally would put something like an updated at on here, but since we can't edit our tweets, we're not going to be doing that because Twitter doesn't allow you to edit tweets, at least if you don't have, fancy stuff that you pay for. So in our case, we're not going to be doing any of that stuff. So we give this a quick save. Now what we need to do is actually set up our relations between the two. So first of all, what we can do is we can say each tweet has a user, and a user is a type of user. So we're mapping to that user type. And we're saying that this is a relationship that is going to be mapping on the field user ID. And that field references the ID field inside of our user table. And importantly, whenever I delete a user, I want to also delete all the tweets that that user created as well. Now again, I'm getting that same error where it's saying that there's no indexing created, so I want to create an index here for my user ID just to make sure I don't have that error show up. Also, if I come down all the way here to where my user is, you're going to notice it created this row right here. I'm just going to change this to tweets instead of a uppercase tweet, and there we go. Now it's going to be an array of tweets that we can access. If I come back up to here, and from here, what we want to do is define our actual like. So inside of our like, we're going to have a user ID, which is a string, and we're going to have a tweet ID, which is also a string. There we go. And instead of specifying an ID on our like, I know that a user can only like an individual tweet once, which means that if a user ID and a tweet ID, there's never going to be more than one record in our database that have the same user ID and the same tweet ID. So I know that these two are unique when used together. So what I can do is I can say our ID is just going to be the combination of our user ID and our tweet ID, just like that, since these two are always going to be unique from one another. Also, I can get my user just like this by doing that same relation stuff. So we can do fields is going to be user ID. We can make sure we reference our ID. And again, I'm going to do a simple on delete of cascade, since if I delete the user, I'm going to delete their likes as well. I'm going to do the same thing with a tweet. So here it's going to say tweet. This is our tweet ID. It references the ID, and I'm going to do the same thing with deletion. So if I delete the tweet, I obviously can delete all the IDs associated with it. Then I can create my indexes, one for user ID and one for tweet ID, just like that. And if I give this a save, it's going to automatically put my likes in here. I'm going to call this likes just like that. And then down here inside my user, it's doing the same thing. I'm going to call this likes as well. There we go. Now the very last thing that we need to do for our user, I'm actually going to put a comment here that just essentially says non-next auth, because this is stuff that's not related to next auth. The last thing we need to do is actually be able to follow users. And this is a many-to-many relationship because a user can follow many other users and they can be followed by many users as well. So this is actually rather easy to set up inside of Prisma. We can just say that we're going to have some followers, and that's going to be a user array. And we can just set up a relation, and we can say that the name here is going to be followers, just like that. And I can do the exact same thing with some follows. And these are the people. So we have people that we're following, or the people that are following us, as well as the people we are following, just like that. And now by giving these relations the same name, we're essentially saying that they are linked up to one another. So all of the followers of one user, they're linked up to the follows of the other user that they're actually following. And normally you would need a table in the middle to actually hook this up, but Prisma automatically creates that join table for you, which is really nice. So we can write these two simple lines, and now we automatically have the ability to follow different users. Now with that done, we can go ahead and we can actually push these changes to our real database. So we can say npx prisma db push. That's going to push all the changes from our schema up to our PlanetScale development database. And if we come in here, and I just make this a little bit larger, go to our branches, go to dev, we should hopefully see that it's going to have some changes inside of here. As you can see, there we go, it just loaded. We have dropped some tables, which is the example table. We've created some tables for our followers in the joining, our like, and our tweet. So it's making all of these changes for us, and we can create a deploy request to put this up to production if we want, which in our case, why not? Let's go ahead and do that. So we'll just set that up. I'll click deploy changes. There we go. So now it's going to deploy those, and in the background, those will be done while we're working on the rest of our project. Now from here, we can go ahead and actually start working on some of the more fun stuff, which is going to be dealing with our React application in the Next.js code. So let's say npm run dev to get it started up on development, close out of Prisma because we don't need to deal with the database. And inside of here for our pages, we can go into our _app page, and this is essentially our root of our entire application. Now inside of here, we don't really want to modify too much. All we want to do is change what we're rendering inside of this section here. This component right here just allows you to render all of your children, but we want to render some stuff around them as well, because the way Twitter works is that they're going to have a sidebar on the side. Also, I want to be able to have a head component that has things like our title. So I can come in here and I can say head, and that's going to be coming from our next head. And inside of here, I can say that our title is just going to be Twitter clone. And then we can, give it a description, for example. So I can come in here with a meta tag. We can say meta name equals description. And let's say content here is equal to this is a Twitter clone by web dev simplified. It doesn't really matter what this says. So now what we can do is we can actually go into our index page, because right now they have the head inside of here. Also, let's get this link for our favicon. We'll put that in here as well. But inside of our index, we'll get rid of this head inside of here, and we'll actually get rid of all of the content inside this entire page. And we're just going to replace this with a single H1 that says hi, just so we can see if we're on this page. I'm going to get rid of this query, get rid of the API, get rid of all of that stuff. And I'm going to get rid of this entire auth showcase as well. We're just going to completely remove that. and remove all of this. So overall, this page has almost nothing inside of it. If we come over here, you can see it just has the text hi. And you'll also notice it says Twitter clone at the top, which means it's using this head element right here. Now from here, what I want to do is I want to wrap everything inside of a div, which is going to be our container. So we can give it a class name of container, just like that. And I can also say I want to center this by saying our MX is going to be auto. And let's make this display flex as well for how we're going to lay out the rest of the content inside of here. So for now, we can just put our component in there. And just by doing that, if I zoom out here and I make my page a little wider, you'll notice that now everything is slightly indented from the side. That's what that container class is doing for us. Now what we can also do is we can say we want to create a side nav. And that's because inside of Twitter, we're going to have a sidebar. So we have a side nav component. It's currently not created at all. We're just going to leave that as is for now. And the next thing I want to do is actually create all of our main section. And that's going to be inside this div, which we're going to give a quick class name here, which is going to be min h is going to be screen. So it's automatically going to fill the full screen height if possible. Our flex grow here is going to be set so that it's going to take up as much space as possible. And then we want some border on the left and the right. So we'll say border X. And with that done, if we just comment outside nav for now, you'll notice we have borders on the left and the right hand side. It's a little bit tough to see because they're rather thin, but they are there for us. And that works just like Twitter does. Now, obviously, the next thing is going to be our side navigation. So to create this, what we want to do inside of our source, we'll create a components folder. And inside of here, we're just going to say that we want to create a new file called sidenav.tsx. And what we can do is export a function called sideNav. And we can just return an h1 that says nav for now. And then inside of here, we can make sure that we import that just like that. And you can see it's importing it right up here. So if we give that a save, you can now see our nav is showing up on the left-hand side. Now, if we jump into that side nav, we can start giving it some styles. So I'm going to remove that text. We're going to use a nav here. And I'm going to give it some classes on it. And we know for a fact we want this to be sticky to the top. So we'll say sticky and top 0. And we want to make sure that this is aligned to the start of our page, because it is currently inside of a Flux container. If we just go over to our site or our app here, you can see that we are inside of a Flux container. So we want to make sure that this is stuck to the top of our Flux container. That's going to work fine. We could also, I guess, say align items. I'm sorry, it's just called items start. And that's going to do the same thing. So we don't even need to have this right here. Then what we can do is we can add some padding. So we'll say px2 and we'll say py is going to be 4. Give that a quick save. You'll notice currently it has nothing inside of it. If I say hi, you can see that that has its padding and everything set up, which is great. So now with that done, we can come into here. We can say that we're going to have a UL because this is essentially going to be a list of items. I'm going to give them some classes as well. I want this to be using Flexbox. I'm then going to say I'm going to be using columns for this. So we're going to say flex column. We're going to use items start on this as well as gap2. And then I also want to make sure my white space doesn't wrap at all. So there we go. Really what these styles have done is give us something that stacks on top of each other. Everything is aligned to the left-hand side and we gave it a little bit of space in between. Now what we can do is go through each one of our LIs, and inside of these, we just want to have a really basic link. We're going to be using our next link for that. So for example, we're going to have a link that goes to our home page. And for our link, we're just going to say href is equal to home, just like that. So now we have our home link. I can copy this down one more time, and we're going to have a link for going to our individual profile as well. So for this one, we need to make sure that our href is based on our actual user ID. So we can say profiles / because that's the route we're going to do. Essentially in our pages here, we're going to create a new folder called profiles. And then inside of that, we're going to create a file called bracket ID bracket.tsx. And that essentially gives us a route to this URL. So if we put an ID inside of here, that's where it's going to route to. So this is going to be something like user.id. We just need to get that user.id. So to do that is actually really easy. We can come all the way up here. We can say our const session is equal to use session, and this comes from Next.auth. And this session has a user on it. So we can say const user equals session.data. And you can see we have user here. And this is sometimes going to be there and sometimes not. If we're logged in, we're going to have a user. And if we're not logged in, obviously there is no user. So we can use that user to get the ID here. And we only want to render this link if our user is not equal to null. So if our user is not equal to null, then we're going to render out the link to go to our profile. So currently we're logged in, so we have this profile link. And if I click on that, you can see it goes to /profile/ and then whatever the ID of that user is. Now this page doesn't export anything, so right now that's why we're getting an error. So we can just close out of that and come back to here. Next, we want to have our login and log out links. So for that, we can just do again a check here. If our user is equal to null, then we want to render our log out link. So if they're equal to null, we're going to come in here and render out the log out link. Otherwise, we're going to render the login link down below it. So we'll just put null for both of these for now. And the first one I want to tackle is going to be the login link. So we can put that instead of an li, kind of like we've done here. But instead of using a button, or instead of using a link, I'm sorry, we're going to be using a button, just like this. Make sure I spelled button correctly. And this is going to be called log out. There we go. And we're going to have an on click here that is going to log our user out. So how exactly do we get that? Well, there's a function called sign out that we can get from Next.auth. So you can see we imported that up here, and that'll sign our user out for us. Now, because we're using TypeScript and it's rather strict, we essentially need to say we don't care about the return. So we can just say void this sign out here, and it's going to say that we don't care about whatever the return value of this is. Now, I want to do essentially the exact same thing for sign in. So we can get the sign in function. This will just say log in instead. So now you can see we have the login button if the user currently exists. So right now I have this flopped. If our user is null, we want to log the user in. And if they are not null, we want to log them out. So I just have these swapped. This will say sign in, and this will say sign out. There we go. So now you can see I click log out right here, and it's going to log my user out, but it doesn't look like it's quite working. The reason this isn't working is because onClick is trying to pass the event argument to sign out, which is causing it to fail. So instead, we just need to define the function like this, and we do the same exact thing with sign in. There we go. So now when I click log out, you can see it logs me out, and I click log in, brings me to that page where I can sign in with Discord. I can click authorize, and boom, there we go. I'm signed in as WebDev Simplified. Now there's a lot of stuff I can do for styles of these different links, but for now I'm just going to leave that till later because it's kind of boring compared to some of the more interesting stuff like actually getting the Twitter clone to work. One thing I did miss though, if we go into our app here, there's one additional style that we should add on to this div right here just to add some spacing on the right. So we'll say small PR4. That's going to add some padding on the right whenever it's a small screen or larger. So if I zoom out to a more normal screen size here, I shrink this down, you're going to notice that our sidebar over here for our border, there's just a little bit of padding on the side. It just looks a little bit better to actually be able to see that border. But obviously on a smaller screen or when I'm super zoomed in like this, obviously we don't need that. That's why I made sure that this only shows up on those smaller or on the larger screens, sorry. So now what we can do is we can go to this index page here and actually implement this bulk section in the middle. Because on Twitter, we have a few different things we want to do. We want to be able to create some tweets as well as display all the tweets at the bottom. So let's go ahead and get started by just creating a header. So first I'm going to do some empty tags here because we're going to have multiple things we want to return, with the first one being our header. And this header is going to have a bunch of classes applied to it. So we want this to be sticky as well at the top, so top 0. And we want to make sure it shows up above everything. So we'll give it a Z index of 10. Also, we're going to give it some border on the bottom because everything in Twitter has all these borders around it. We're going to make sure the background is white, and we're going to add some padding on the top of it as well. Then inside of the header is where we can actually put our header, which will go inside of an H1. It'll just say home. Now all we need to do is add some class names to that as well. So we'll say margin bottom is 2 to give it a little space. PX is going to be 4, again, spacing things out. We'll make the text a little bit larger, and we're going to make it bold. So now you can see it says home right there. And if our page scrolled, you'll see that this will follow our page down as we go. So that's really what we need to do for our header section. So now we can move on to the section for our new tweet form. I'm actually going to create a custom component for this, just like that, so we can use this anywhere we want. So this is going to be for creating a brand new tweet. We'll put it right inside of here, new tweet form.tsx. There we go. Export function new tweet form. And inside of this page, we can just do a quick import on that. There we go. So now if we just make sure that this actually returns something, it'll now say new, just like that. So inside of this new tweet form, let's just go ahead and get some of our JSX in place before we start focusing on a bunch of logic. First of all, we're going to have our form, which is going to have a bunch of classes on it as per usual. So we're going to come in here and say we have flex, and we want this to be a column-based flex layout. Our gap is going to be 2, and we're going to have some border on the bottom, as well as some similar spacing of px4 and py2. If I just put some text inside of here, you can see that now we have that spacing as well as that border. And the next thing I want to do inside of here is I want to create a div that's going to be essentially a row for our form. This is going to contain where our text information is going to go, as well as our profile image. Then below that, we're going to have an actual button for whatever we want. So this is going to be a button down here. And then this right here is going to be where we actually put our text area. So the first thing I want to do is style out our text area. We're going to give this a class name, again, of flex, because I do everything pretty much with flexbox. And we'll say it'll have a gap of 4. And that's because there'll be two things. There's going to be a profile image, which I'm actually going to create a custom component for because we're going to use that literally everywhere. And it's going to take in a source, which is whatever our user, URL is. For now, we'll just say URL, doesn't matter, whatever it is. And then we're going to have our text area. And this is actually going to be where we input all of our information for our actual code. So if we just comment out profile image for now and save, you can see we have a text area and we have our button down here. So that is working. Now for our text area, we can give it some styles. So we can say our class name here is going to be flex grow. We want it to be able to not be resized. So we'll say resize none because we're going to handle that automatically. We're going to make sure our overflow is hidden. That'll help us with that automatic resizing. And then we're going to give it some padding as well as make the text inside of here a little bit larger and remove any outline that is on it. Now, if we give that a quick save, you'll notice it's essentially invisible. And even when I click on it, it's invisible. But that's how the actual Twitter one is. It's kind of weird, but that's how it works. But you can see as we enter some text inside of here, it's limited to its specific size, but obviously we can make it bigger or smaller automatically inside the code. Also, I'm going to give this a placeholder, and inside of Twitter, there's says what's happening. So that is what we're going to put inside of ours as well. So now if we give this a refresh, you can see we have that text and we can click inside of there. Now the next thing I want to work on is our button, and I'm actually going to use a custom component for this. So let's create a brand new component called button.tsx, because pretty much all of our buttons are going to follow a similar layout inside of our code. So we'll export that function. Here we'll just return a button just like that. Come into here and we'll make sure that we import that. Whoops, button, there we go. Import that, perfect. And this is just going to say tweet. There we go. I think that's what it says on Twitter. And now we can go over to our button and we can get all of the different props that we want from it. So for this button, we know that we have a few props that we want to add that are custom, as well as a bunch of other props, which are going to be button specific. So here I can put all of our button specific props just like that. And then we can follow it up with our custom props that we need. For example, I'm going to have a prop called small, as well as gray, to determine if this button is a grayscale and if it's going to be large or small. Also, I want to add the ability to pass in custom class names as well. There we go. So now let's actually create the type for our button props. There we go. And we're going to set this to that button props. So if we save this real quick, we know that small here is going to be a Boolean. We know that gray is also a Boolean. And we also know that class name is going to be an optional string. And technically, all of these properties are optional. So this is optional, and they have default values of false. You don't need to explicitly put them, but I kind of like to. And then what I want to do is I want to make sure that this has the same properties as a button inside of React. If I hover over this button, you can see right here exactly what those props are. So I'm just going to copy this, and I can just say right here, ampersand that. And now if I just make sure I import everything properly, add that import, and we're going to add that import in. And if we add that last angle bracket in, and we give this a save, make sure we import only the types from this. Now we actually have it so that the props are being properly imported, which means inside of this new tweet, I can set any normal prop that I could set on a button. For example, I could set an on-click property if I wanted. Now to style out our button, we need to do quite a few things. So we need to create some different classes. So I'm going to have some classes that are based on size. So we'll say size classes is equal to, and if we are small, we're going to have certain classes, which are going to be px2 and py1. And if we are a large button, I am instead going to have px4, and we're going to be py2, and I'm also going to change my font to bold. So if we're a smaller button, we just have less padding. Now for our gray classes, these are going to be our color classes. Here we're going to check to see if we are currently gray. If we are gray, then we want all of our backgrounds to be gray. So we're going to have a background gray of 400. Our text here will be white, and actually it'll be white no matter what, so we can leave that off. Our hover for the background, we'll change it to a slightly lighter gray. And if the focus is visible for tab accessibility, we're going to set it to the same gray 300. There we go. Now I want to essentially do the exact same thing, but I want to change these colors to blue. So we're going to here have a blue, and this one's going to be a blue 500. This one is going to be a blue 400. And this one is going to be a blue 400 as well. So depending on if we're gray or not gray, we're going to have gray or blue styles. Then on our button, we can actually have our classes, and the classes are going to be essentially all of our normal classes plus these custom ones that depend on all of our different styles. So we want it to be rounded as a pill shape, so we'll say rounded full. We want to be able to transition on our colors, and we're going to have a duration of 200 for our animation timing. And if the button is disabled, I want to change the cursor to the not allowed cursor. Also, if it's disabled, I want to set the opacity here to 50%. Make sure our text is white, and then finally put in all of these other classes. So we have our size classes, as well as our color classes, and then finally any custom class names that we need. There we go. So if I give that a quick save, you can already see that we have this giant button showing up right here and filling the entire width. Now we don't want our button to quite look like that. So on this page, we can come in here and we can pass in some custom class names. For example, on this one, I may want to make it so that it is going to be aligned. And actually, I believe this is called self-end inside of Tailwind. There we go. So that's going to push that all the way to the end. And if we zoom out to normal scale, you can kind of see what this looks like. And the next thing we can do is to work on our profile image. So let's create a component for that. Profile image.tsx, export function profile image. Let's return an h1 for now. Export, there we go. Make sure I import that in here. There we go. And now, of course, we know that this profile image needs to take in some specific classes. We're going to have a source as well as any custom classes we want to pass in as well. Profile image props. Type profile image props. Here we have our source, which is going to be a string. And also, really importantly here, this can also be undefined or null. So we're essentially making this an optional property because if we don't have an image, which is possible, we want to make sure we fall back to a default image. Then the next thing we can do is do our class name. That is going to be optional as well, and it's going to be a string. There we go. So now instead of our profile image, what we want to do is we want to check to see if we actually have the correct property. But before we do that, I actually want to wrap everything inside of a div that's going to give us essentially our normal default styling for how we want to round everything and so on. And then we can just plop in the image or our fallback value. So here for our div, let's give it a bunch of classes. We'll say class name here. We want it to be a relative position so we can absolutely position everything inside of it. We want to have a height here of 12 and a width of 12. Our overflow is going to be hidden, so we can make sure that all of our rounding actually takes effect. So we'll say rounded full to give us a circle, and then we'll pass in any custom class names that we need, just like that. Make sure that we actually properly do this. There we go. And then inside of here, we can do our check to see if our source is equal to null. If our source is equal to null, then we want to render our fallback value. Otherwise, we're going to render our actual value. So for now, the fallback is just going to be null, but otherwise, we're going to render out an image. And we can actually use the next image component for this. So let's make sure we give it all the properties it needs. For example, it needs a source, so we can give it our source right here. It also needs an alt, which is going to say profile image. And then we need to give it a quality, which in our case is going to be 100. We're saying essentially we want this to be 100% quality, don't downgrade it at all. And then if we say fill, it's going to fill the entirety of its parent, and we just need to make sure we give it a relative position for this fill to work properly. Now if we give this a quick save, we just need to make sure obviously that our URL is a correct URL. So inside of here, instead of passing along this fake URL, let's get that URL from our user. So we can say session equals use session, just like that. And if our session dot status is equal to, or sorry, not equal to authenticated, then we're just going to return. So for now, we're just going to do this because essentially we're saying don't render this out, obviously, because we aren't authenticated, so we can't create a new tweet. So now if we get down to this point, our session.data.user we know exists because we are authenticated. So we're just going to get the image from them. So now if we save, you'll notice we're getting a different error. If I zoom this in, essentially it says hostname cdn.discord.app is not configured in your next config. So let's just copy this real quick, go over to our next config, which is all the way over here. And we need to make sure that we put this inside of our hostname property. So we can say that this is going to be for our CDN, I believe. Actually, it's called images. So we'll say images, domains, and then we want to specify that URL right there. And you can get that by just clicking on this link right here. Let's put a comment at the end of this, give this a quick save right here. And now hopefully if we refresh our page, we'll zoom to a more normal zoom level, you can see our profile image, was showing up right there. If I log back in, you'll see it'll show up. And you'll notice when we were logged out, this form didn't show up at all. But there you go, you can see the image showing up exactly as we would expect. Now, the next thing I want to work on is make it so that this input automatically sizes itself based on the content inside of it, because that's how Twitter works. So to do that, we first need to set our style here to a height of 0. That's just going to essentially remove all the height, which is what we want. And then we want to automatically calculate that every single time that our text changes. So we can essentially hook up an on change as well as some state. So we can say const input value set input value equals use state with an empty string. There we go. So our value here is equal to that. And our on change, we're just going to say, whoops, set input value to e.target.value. There we go. So now at least when I change things, it's properly hooked up, but of course I want to make it so that when I actually start changing the height, the actual input box changes as well. Now the easiest way to do this is actually, we're just going to create a function out here. It's called update text area height, or we'll call it size. This is going to take in a text area, which is optional, and we'll say HTML text area. There we go. The reason I'm making this optional is because when we call this, we may not actually have a text area. So if our text area is equal to null, then just don't do anything at all. But if we do have a text area, this is how easy it is to actually do this dynamic height. All we do is first set the actual height to 0. There we go. And this needs to be a string. Then what we can do is we can take our text area and we can specify that the height again is going to be equal to a string. But this string is going to come from our text area, text area dot scroll height. And we can just add pixels onto the end of that, and that's going to give us the exact size our text box needs to be to fit all of the text inside of it. That's how easy this is. It only takes a couple lines, but hooking that up inside of React is a little bit more complex. Now the first thing you may think of is, okay, we just throw down a simple use effect, just like this, and this use effect is going to change on our input value, and we can just pass into here this function, and then we can get whatever our text area is, just like this. And that text area can come from a reference. So we can say text area ref equals use ref. And we know that this is going to be an HTML text area element. So we can pass in the current value just like that. And if we scroll all the way down here, we can set our ref like this. You may think that that's all that we need to do to make this work, but it's actually not quite that easy. Also, we need to make sure we set this to null like that. There we go. So now if we refresh our page, you'll notice it still doesn't have the correct size being set. It's not until I make my first change to my actual input value that the size is being set. But when I do a first page refresh here, it's not being set. And there's a few reasons why that is. Now the reason for this is because the first time our use effect runs, it doesn't actually have access to this reference yet because this reference hasn't been defined, so it doesn't know how to update the height. Also, this technically should be a use layout effect. Just because of the way that use layout effect works, we're changing the height of something, so it should be using use layout effect instead of use effect. But even if I give that a save and a refresh, you'll notice it still doesn't quite work as we expect it to. What we really need to do is we need to make sure that we run some code as soon as our text area gets added to the page. We can do this by using a reference as a callback. This is a bit confusing, but I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. We can just say use callback here, and this is going to call a function which is going to get our text area as the input into it. And we can call that function. So we can just call this function by passing it in that text area like that. There we go. And then we can make sure that we only ever call this use callback one time. Now this use callback, we're going to set to an input ref variable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and set it as my ref here. So what this does is when you set a ref to essentially a function, like we've done here with our use callback, what it's going to do is it's going to call this use callback and it's going to pass the text area in as the actual property. So that means as soon as our text area gets added to the page, it's going to call this function and it's going to update that size. So we know that this is an HTML text area. There we go, just like that. And then all I need to do is just take my text area ref.current. I'm going to set it equal to my text area. And then just make sure we remove this dull from here so that we know that it is modifiable. So now if I give that a save and a refresh, you're going to notice my actual element has the correct height right when my page refreshes. And if I change it and change it back, you can see that it's still automatically updating the height always. Now this still isn't quite perfect though. The actual output is perfect, but if we scroll up here, you're going to notice we actually get some errors. It's saying use layout effect is nothing on the server because it's essentially not ran. So try not to use this on the actual server. So what we can do is we can actually export, or we can actually create a new function. I'm going to call this one form. And inside of here, I'm just going to take all the code that I have in my new tweet form. I'm just going to copy all of this, paste it into there. There we go. So now essentially I've taken everything and put it inside this form component. And now we have our new tweet form and it's completely separate. And in here, I'm going to do a small check. I'm going to get our session. I'm going to check to see if our session is not authenticated, and I'm just going to return. Otherwise, I'm going to render out our form. By doing this one really small minor change, essentially what I've done is I've gone from actually rendering all the code inside of here, and I've said, okay, if I'm not authenticated, just don't render anything at all. So it never runs that, use layout effect on the server, which is great because we're never authenticated on the server. Also, the reason we're getting this error here is because this should return null and not undefined, and that'll clean up that error right there. Now we actually have this working. Let's just make it so we can actually create this tweet on the actual backend, so we can actually post it and create it and show this tweet on the page. Because so far we've done a lot of work and we don't have any interaction on our page yet. So the first step we need to do is actually give us a way to actually create this information on the server. So if we open our application up and we go over to the server section, you'll notice inside of API we have these routers. As you can see, we have an example router here. I'm just going to rename this example router to our tweet router, just like that. And instead of being called example here, we'll call it tweet, just like that. Now we can essentially remove all these different procedures. We don't need any of these. What we want to do is be able to create our own procedures. So we're going to have a create here, and this create is going to be a protected procedure. That just means that you must be authenticated to do this. So to create a tweet, you need to be logged in. That makes sense. And here we're going to do a mutation. A mutation allows us to modify data. This is going to be an async function. And this async function is going to take in our input, which is essentially going to be an object. We're just going to pass in some content, just like this. So instead of text here, we're going to call this content. And then afterwards, we're going to have access to our context variable as well. This has things like our database as well as our user information inside of it. There we go. Then in our root here, we need to make sure wherever we have this example, we change it to tweet, tweet, and tweet, just like that. There we go. That should hook everything up. And now we just need to make this actual mutation happen. So to do that, we can use Prisma, and Prisma can be accessed on our context by saying ctx.prisma and dot, and now we can access, for example, the tweet section. You'll notice our autocomplete doesn't have that information. If you run into this problem, then most likely what you need to do is you need to reload your TypeScript experience. So just say TypeScript restart TS server, hit enter, and now you can see that this is auto-completed properly. So anytime you modify Prisma, you may have to run that restart to get it to actually start working. So now I can just call the create function here. This takes in some data, and the data has our content, which is what we care about. We also need to make sure we actually put in the user. So our user ID here, which is coming from our context dot, context dot session dot user dot ID. There we go. So that is going to be creating our user. This is an asynchronous function, so we need to make sure we await that. And we're just going to return the result of that back down to the server. Now you will notice we're getting an error. This error essentially says, oops, let me hover over this, unsafe return type of any. This is currently a bug from everything that I've seen that deals with Prisma, and it deals with ESLint for TypeScript, because obviously all of this stuff is properly typed based on Prisma. As you can see, it's properly returned to be all these different types, but it just doesn't know that it's returning all these types. So what we can do is we can modify this file right here to essentially ignore those things. So in this override section, we can just paste down some rules that are going to ignore some of these unsafe things with any. I hate having this kind of information in there, but essentially this is a bug right now. So I'm just adding this in, and hopefully when you watch this video, you won't run into these problems, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. And if so, let me know it down in the comments, but I had no idea how to fix this problem without just disabling these errors. So what we can do inside of here is we're just going to say, we're going to set this to a variable tweet, just like that. And then we're just going to return tweet down here, just like that. It looks like even that isn't quite enough to get rid of all these errors. So I have a couple other ones that we need to do. We have no unsafe call and no unsafe return. That should hopefully fix those errors, and there we go, it did. Like I said, this seems to be a little bit of a bug with how Prisma's generating its code and how ESLint is reading that. I'm not entirely sure why the issue is, but if you know more about it, please let me know down in the comments below. So with that done, we now actually have the ability to create tweets, which is great. So we can go over to this new tweet form and we can actually try to use that information, which is amazing. So down here, what we can do is we can say that we want to access our API. So we just say API, this comes from /utils/API, just like that. We want to be able to access the tweet section, so we can say .tweet, and we want to be able to create a tweet. This is going to be a mutation, so we're going to use the use mutation hook, and we for now don't need to pass it any information. We can just say const create tweet is equal to that. Then we can actually create this tweet by hooking up an on submit event handler. So we can say handle submit function handle submit. That takes in a form event, and we can just say e.prevent default. There we go. Then we can call this create tweet function, passing it in our content, which is just our content from our page, which is our input value, just like that. And to actually call this, we need to make sure we call the mutate function. There we go. So now we can pass it our content just like that. There we go. And that should actually create a tweet inside of our database for us, which is really great. And to test that, inside of here, we have an onSuccess function. And this onSuccess function will take in our tweet. We'll call it our new tweet. And I'm just going to console.log our new tweet so we can actually see if it is being created. Also inside of here, I'm probably going to set our input value to an empty string just to clear it out because that makes sense. Now let's inspect, get our console opened up, go over to our console here, make sure everything's cleared, type in some information, click tweet, and you'll notice that it actually sent that off. It got the information back for us. And then down here, you can see that I just created a tweet with this content, the created at date, as well as our ID and our user ID. So it is actually properly creating our information. Now we can go ahead and show it on the screen. So let's remove this console log for now since we don't need it. We're going to come back over to our actual page here. So if we open up our pages, go to our index page, we have our new tweet form showing up. It's saying that it cannot be used because it does potentially return undefined. Let's just make sure this says return null. There we go. That'll fix that error for us. And now below here, we can essentially render out all of the recent tweets. So we'll say recent tweets, close that off, and let's create that function. Recent tweets. Now this function itself is going to be rather straightforward. We're first going to get our tweets. I don't know how to do that yet, so we're just going to leave that as an empty array. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn a new component, and this new component is going to be a component we create. I'm going to call it infinite tweet list. And I'm breaking this into a component because we're going to be using this all over our application. So we have this infinite tweet list, which is obviously going to take in our tweets. So we'll say tweets is equal to tweets, just like that. It's just going to take in our array of tweets. And now we can create this component. So let's just copy that file name, .tsx, export function. There we go. We know for a fact it's going to take in tweets as one of its properties. And then we make sure that I spell infinite correctly. Looks like I spelled it wrong in all of those places. So there we go. That is now spelled correctly, and we can import this just like that. Now, the first thing I want to do is get our tweet information so we can actually start rendering it to the screen. The easiest way to do that is, again, going to be in our router. We need to have a way to get tweets, and we can access these tweets whether or not we are logged in. So we want to make sure that this is a public route for us. So we can call this infinite feed because we want to make sure that this is infinite scrolling. And again, I spelled infinite incorrectly. This is going to be a public procedure. And for our input here, we need to specify some objects that we're going to have. So our object here is going to have a few properties. The first is going to be a limit, which is going to be a number. And this is also going to be optional. So I'm going to make sure it's optional. And then we're going to pass in a thing called a cursor. That if you're not sure what a cursor is, I'll explain it in just a little bit, but it's how we're going to handle pagination. So we're going to make this an object, and it's going to be an ID that is a string, string. And it's going to also have a created at, which is also going to be a date, just like that. And this entire thing is going to be optional. So if I give that a quick save, put a comma right there, there we go. You can now see that we have two properties here. We have a limit as well as our cursor for our pagination, which has an ID and a created at field, and both of these are optional. Then what we can do is we can say that we want to run a query. So we can want to get data is a query. This is going to take a function just like mutation. So I'm just going to copy this code right here. And inside of here, instead of a content, we're going to have a limit as well as a cursor. And both of these are going to be undefined to start. And our limit, by default, we're just going to set to 10. Obviously, you would want to make this much larger if you're working inside of a real application. But to test pagination, we're making it quite small. So to make this query work, what we want to do is we want to get our context, we want to get Prisma, we want to get our tweets. And what I want to do is I want to call find many to get multiple tweets. And here's where all of our pagination is going to happen. So we're going to set our take property. That's how many we want to get. We're going to set it to our limit plus 1. And there's a reason we're doing that, and I'll explain it in just a second. Then we have this thing called a cursor. So if our cursor is set, then what I want to do is I want to pass along our cursor. And we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So for now, I'll just say, ID, and we'll pass it in our cursor like this. Otherwise, we're going to pass in undefined here. Next thing that we want to do is to be able to select the things we want as well as to set up our where clause. But most importantly, we need our order by. And here we're going to order by two different properties. First, we're going to order by our created at, and we're going to put this in descending order so that we can order our tweets from newest to oldest. And then I'm also going to be ordering here by our ID. And I'll explain exactly why we're ordering by both of these in just a second, because you may think ordering by created at is enough, but it's actually not quite going to be enough. So the type of pagination that I'm doing is a little different than your normal pagination where you essentially say, skip the first 50 results, because normally you would just say like skip page times your limit. This is how a normal pagination would work. You say, give me 10 items, and if I'm on page 3, skip the first 30 of them. In this case, we're using cursor-based pagination. So what you need to do is a cursor is essentially a unique identifier, and every single element has some unique identifier to it. And these are going to be sequential. So for example, like IDs that go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those are unique. And what you do is you pass along the ID of the element you want to start with at. So in our case, our cursor is where we want to start in the list, and then we're taking however many we want plus 1. The reason we're adding 1 to the end is because that'll give us the next item we start with, that last item, that 1 that we added. Now the thing that makes this a little bit more confusing is that created at is technically not unique. If two people post a tweet at the exact same millisecond, they're going to have the exact same created at time. And that's not ideal, and as you get a large social media application, it is possible that they would have multiple things created at the exact same time. So in our case, what we're doing is we're making a cursor a combination of our created at as well as our ID. Now the ID is only there in the cases where two created ats are created at the exact same time. So what we need to do is we need to say that our ID and created at are unique so we can actually make this work. And we need to modify Prisma to do that. So what we can do is we can go all the way up to our tweets, and we actually need to set up a uniqueness constraint between our created at and our ID. And we're saying that every single tweet is going to have a unique created at and ID combination. And obviously that makes sense because every single ID is already unique on its own, so it doesn't matter even if all the created ats are exactly the same. So with that, we can actually come in here, npx prisma db push. That's going to allow us to actually use our cursor in this particular way. Let me make sure I did this correctly. Looks like I spelled Prisma wrong. There we go. Prisma db push. That'll actually push those changes up to our development environment for us. And here it's saying we're essentially adding a uniqueness constraint, and it's possible that there may be duplicates, but I know for a fact there are not. So now we can go back into here, and for our cursor, we have this thing here. If I just make sure I reset my TypeScript server, you'll see, give it a second here, created at ID. There we go. So this is a combination of our created at and ID, and we can pass in our cursor. Essentially, it's saying, give me an ID and give me a created at value. So again, to really explain what's going on, because I know this is really confusing, we're going to say, hey, give me the 10 most recent tweets. It'll run this query. Our cursor is blank to start, so it passes undefined, so we can ignore that. And our limit is 10, so it's going to give us the 11 most recent tweets. What we're going to do is we're going to return 10 of them, and then we're going to look at the 11th one, and we're going to get the created at date as well as the ID, and we're going to pass that down. And we're saying, hey, here's a unique ID and a unique created at time, and we're saying every single time you re-query this data to get the next 10 most recent tweets, start from this particular tweet. So we're just essentially giving us a start point. So we're ordering everything by created at, and then the only reason we have ID thrown in here is in the case where we accidentally have two things that have the exact same created at time, which is very unlikely, but it could happen if your application is quite large. This still may seem confusing, but as we actually implement it, I promise you it'll make so much more sense. So this is just for our pagination, so now we actually need to select everything we're going to do. By default, we don't even need to worry about a where clause because we want to just get all of the tweets that are recent, but we do only care about selecting certain things. For example, I want the ID of the tweet, I want the actual content of the tweet, I want the created at time for the tweet so I can display that. And I also want to get certain count variables to determine, for example, how many likes the tweet has. So I want to select, for example, how many likes a tweet has, just like that. So I'm getting the count of the likes as well. Now, another thing that's really interesting is I also want to get the information related to the user. So I can say user, and I want to select specific properties. For example, the name of the user, the ID of the user, and the image of the user. So I can make sure that I can actually show their profile, show their name, and create a link to go to their profile. Now, the final thing that's a little bit confusing is I want to determine, has this tweet been liked by this user yet or not? Because you can only like a tweet once, and I want to show you the tweets you have already liked. So to do that, we need to get the current user. So all the way up here, current user ID is just going to be our context.session.user.id. And this could potentially be null because this is a public route, so you can access it even if you don't have an account at all. So here, if our current user ID is equal to null, well then what I want to do is just not get any information at all related to the likes because it doesn't matter, the person's not logged in, so obviously they've never liked anything. Otherwise, I only want to get the likes where the user ID is equal to my current user ID. So now if there are any likes being returned, that means the user has liked that tweet. And we can just say that this is going to be equal to some tweets like that. Also, we should make sure we await this as well. So now we have access to our tweets right here, which is going to be an array that has all the information for our user and everything else that we selected. And we need to return that information to our user so we can, return it like this. So now we have our tweets inside of an object. But we also need to give them the next cursor. Essentially, what is the next thing that you can do to do your search? So next time that we call this function, we can pass it along this cursor right here, and it'll start the query from where we left off. And using cursors instead of normal pagination will make sure that if people add new tweets as in between when we search, it's not going to mess up our search. So to get the cursor is quite straightforward. We're going to create a variable called next cursor, and we're going to specify this as a type of cursor. So it's just going to match the exact same type of our cursor, or it could be undefined, in which case, that's perfectly fine. And we're just going to leave it like that. Then what we can do is we can say if our data.length is greater than the limit. If that's the case, then that means, and we can call this tweets actually. There we go, tweets.length. Actually, let's just call it data. That's fine. There we go, data. What that means is essentially that we have gotten more data than we needed. We said limit +1. So if we asked for 10 things and we got back 11, well, that means that there are more things to get. So we have a next cursor. So let's actually set our next cursor. Next cursor. It here is going to be equal to an object. And to get the values for that object, we just want to get the next item. And that is just going to be equal to, I don't need that in an if. Next item is equal to data.pop. Const next item, there we go. And if our next item is not equal to null, then we can set our next cursor equal to an object that is just queried from that data. So next item dot ID, and our created at is our next item dot created at. There we go. So what this small little section right here is done is essentially saying, take the last element, remove it from our array. That's what pop does. It removes it from the array, and then set that element's unique identifier as our next cursor. So when we next do this query, we start from this element right here and continue onwards instead of restarting from the start. Now what we can do is we can make sure that the tweets here that we're actually returning is going to be a slightly modified version of this data. Because this is a little bit tricky to work with, I'm just going to map it a little bit to make it a little bit easier to read the data and use it in our front end. So we'll say data.map for each tweet. We're going to run through here and we return to it an object. So our tweet.id, our content is our tweet.content. A lot of this is going to keep the same. Our created at is our tweet.created at. Our like count is our tweet.like count. And actually, this one's going to be slightly different because we have underscore count dot likes. Our user here, user is just going to be equal to everything that is in our user. So I'm not even going to modify that. We can actually just, there we go, keep that like that. Then what we're going to do is our liked by me. This is the big one. We're going to take our tweet. We're going to check that likes array. And if the length of it is greater than 0, that means that you have currently liked this tweet. So really, I've just massaged the data a little bit so it's a little bit easier to use in our front end. And now speaking of the front end, we can actually use this in our front end. So if we go to this index page, here are tweets, we can get that from our API instead. So we can say API dot, and we want to be able to get some information from it. So let's make sure we import that dot tweet, and I want to get our infinite feed. And this is going to be using an infinite query. So we can say use infinite query just like this. Now for the parameters, we don't want to pass it anything. So we're going to give it an empty object because we don't have any input that we want to pass to it, because by default, we're going to start with the starting page and a limit of 10 is perfectly fine. But we want to pass it another property here called get next page param. This is an option we can pass it. This is going to take in our last page. And then what we can do is we can just say our last page dot next cursor is going to be our next page parameter. So what this does is it essentially says, okay, whenever I want to get the next piece of data, use this next cursor and pass it up as our cursor inside of our TRPC query. So if we go back to here, this cursor property that we defined right here, that's going to be set to whatever we set to this right here. That's how that next cursor thing kind of works. Now for our tweets, we can just change this to say we want to get the data. And if we have some data, it's actually going to give us some pages. So we can take these pages, we can map through each one of these, and I'm actually going to do a flat map. So it's going to return to us a flattened array of data. And all I want to do is I just want to get the tweets from the page because I don't care about the actual next data. Now, some other things I want to pass along here is if we have an error, I want to make sure that gets passed along. So that's just, there's error right here. Same thing for loading. I want to be able to display a loading state. So we'll pass that along. A has more state. To make sure that if we have more, I want to be able to load that data. So if our tweet.has next page, that means that we have more information to load. And then for this, we can fetch some new tweets. That's going to be the function we call to get new data. And that just comes from tweets.fetch next page. Now, if we go over to this infinite list property here, we can make sure we have our tweets here. And we can say that this is going to be our infinite tweet list. There we go. Props. And let's make sure up here we create a type. I'm going to create two types, one for a tweet and then one for our infinite list props. There we go. So we have is loading, which is a Boolean. We have is error, which is a Boolean. We have our as more, which is also a Boolean. Our fetch new tweets. This is going to be a promise. And I really don't care what it returns, so we're just going to specify unknown because I don't know what it returns and I really don't care. And then our tweets is an optional tweet array, just like that, because we may not have any tweets to start with. Then what we can do is we can specify our tweet. So here we have an ID, content, created at, which is going to be a date, like count is a number, liked by me, which is a Boolean, and then finally our user, which is an ID of string, an image, which is a string or it can be null, and then we're going to have a name, which is also a string or it can be null as well. So then down here, let's just get our information. We have is error, is loading, fetch new tweets, and then as more, that's the last one. There we go. And then we can just have some simple checks. If, for example, we are in the loading state, then we're just going to return an H1 that says loading, and we'll replace that with a loading spinner a little bit later. Is error is going to be the same thing, but it'll just say error for us. And then if our tweets equals null, well, then for now, we'll just return null. This just is going to protect us in case for some reason our tweets doesn't exist. And the next thing I want to do is if our tweets.length is equal to 0, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a question mark inside of here, and let's just do tweets equals null or our tweets length equals 0. There we go. Here, I'm going to do a return that's just going to say, hey, you have no tweets. So we'll come in here with an H2 class name. We're going to put a bottom margin on it. We're going to center our text. We're going to make it quite large so it's very easy to see. And we're going to make it a gray color. And we'll just say no tweets. There we go. So this essentially covers all of our potential error use cases. And then below that, we can actually render out what our actual page is going to look like, which is just going to be a UL. Now to handle the infinite scrolling, there's a lot of ways you can do it, but by far the easiest way to do it is just to use a library. So I'm going to install a library called React Infinite Scroll Component, and that's going to handle all of the difficult work that comes with infinite scrolling for us. Let's get our application rerunning again. There we go. And then inside of here, I can use that infinite scroll component. We'll just say infinite scroll, just like that. There we go. Let's make sure I import that. So now it's importing itself up here. We have our infinite scroll. We just need to pass it all of our information. First of all, if we come in here, we need to pass it the length of our data. Well, that is just our tweets dot length. There we go. And then next thing we need to pass is we need to pass it our next, and this is just a function it calls to get our next piece of data. We need to pass it a has more property. Well, we already have that, so let's just come in here with a has more. There we go, super straightforward. And then we have some type of loader, and in our case, we're just going to do the text of loading for now, but we're going to replace this with a loading spinner in the future. Now, the final thing we need to do is actually put what we're going to do to render our tweets. So for now, I'm just going to map through each one of our tweets. I'm going to return a div that has a key, which is tweet.id, and I'll do our tweet.content. So hopefully, if we've done everything correctly, we should actually see it show up on the side. And I just need to make sure I place a return statement here. There we go. And as you can see, we have the text for that one tweet. And if I create a new tweet and I click tweet and I actually refresh our page, you can see that that new tweet just loads in. We'll fix the issue with refreshing the page in a bit, but for now we want to just display our tweets on that page. So let's go ahead and actually create a tweet card function component. So we'll say function tweet card. There we go. And inside of here, we're going to pass it along a bunch of information. For example, our ID, our user, our content, our created at, our like count, and our liked by me. And we know that this is just a tweet. We've already created that type all the way at the top here, so it should match perfectly. Then what we can do inside of here is we can just return, for example, an li, and this li is going to contain all of this information that we need. So first of all, let's specify a class name on here. So our class is going to be flex. We're going to put a gap of 4 inside of here, so it's got a lot of space, a border on the bottom since Twitter loves its borders, and we'll give it some padding in both directions. There we go. So now if we just save that, come up here and replace this with our tweet card. this with our tweet card here. There we go. And we just pass it along all of our tweet properties and give it a save. You can see that now if we put something inside of here, like our content, it should hopefully have a little bit more space. There we go. Now the first thing I want to do is to create a link. And this link is going to wrap our profile image. There we go. So let's pass it in a source, and that source is just user.image. There we go. And then our link has an href, which is going to go to that user's profile. So /profile /profiles /user.id. There we go. Make sure that link is imported properly, give it a save, and now we have our profile image showing up, which is great. Next, I want to show our information for our user as well as some content. So we're going to have a div. We're going to do some flexbox shenanigans. Just like that. It's going to be column based. There we go. And inside of here, we're going to have another div. And this div right here is going to be for showing our user information. So we'll say flex and gap of 1. And inside of here, I'm going to have another link. This one is going to be an href that goes to the exact same location. So I'm just going to copy this because essentially it is the exact same link, but this one is just going to show the user's name instead. So you can see it says web dev simplified. Obviously, we want to give it a little bit of styling. So we'll say class name, font bold, and on the hover, we're going to give it an underline because that is how it is actually done inside of the Twitter site. There we go. We can also do the exact same thing for focusing. So we can say focus visible underline as well. So now if I tab onto it, you can see it gives me the underline, and we can even say outline none to remove that outline. And there we go. Now I also want to show the information for the display time. So below here, I can create a span and I can give it just a dash inside of it. Class name is going to be equal to text gray 500. Copy this down, and this is where I'm going to display the created at information. So I'm going to use a formatter. So I'm going to call this date time formatter. I'm going to call the format function with created at. So up here, const date time formatter equals intl.datetimeFormat. I want to create a new one of those. I want to use the default locale, so undefined. And I'm just going to say date style is going to be short. You can make this whatever you want to be for customization. And if you're curious about this intl function right here, I have a full video covering all these cool different formatters. I'll link it in the cards and description for you. But with that, you can see now we actually have the date showing up right there. Now next, I actually want to show the content. So here we have our div. This contains like all of our user information, this top row. Then below that, we're going to have our content just like this. And what I want to do is add a few classes to it. So I'll say class name equals white space, and I want this to be pre-wrap. And that just means if I have some enters inside of my code and I click tweet, and again, we'll fix the refresh problem in a bit, but you can see all those enters and white spaces are showing up. Finally, right below this, I want to actually show that heart button, and I'm actually going to create a custom component for this because there's quite a lot of logic that goes into this particular heart button. So we'll say function heart button, just like that. We'll just return an h1 that says heart for now. There we go. So inside of here, first of all, I want to get my session to get the user to see if they're logged in, because I obviously don't want this to be a clickable button if the user's not logged in. So if my session.status is not equal to authenticated, well, that means my user is not logged in, so this should not be a clickable button. So here, I'm going to return a div, and this div is going to have a bunch of classes on it. So we'll say class name. I want to add a little bit of margin on the bottom. I want to add some margin on the top here. Flex, I want to center everything. I want to add quite a bit of gap inside of here, and I'll say that I'm going to start this item at the start, and then finally text gray 500 because I don't want it to be a super bright or super dark color. I want it to be a more muted gray color. Then I want to display some type of heart icon, which is a function that we're going to create up here, or actually a component, heart icon. So if this has been liked by me, which is going to come from here, it's just a prop, heart button props, type heart button props, liked by me. That's a Boolean. If it has been liked by me, well, then I want to have it be a filled in heart. Otherwise, I want it to be a normal non-filled in heart. Now to use icons, we're actually going to be using the React icons library. So install npm I React icons. There we go. Give that a quick second to install. Rerun our application. And now we can install the icons, and we're using the VS Code icons. So we can say VSC heart filled. And if we just make sure that we give that a quick second, try to autocomplete that, not working, we'll just manually import it. VSC heart filled from React icons / VSC. There we go. So now if we scroll down, there we go. We can also do our VSC heart, and this one's just called heart like that. We'll update that import. So this one is a filled in heart, and this one is a hollow heart. There we go. So now if we give this a quick save, and we also make sure that we add in here a span that has our like count. There we go. And we actually make it so that this is returned by default. And also our like count needs to be up here. Like count is a number. There we go. So this needs to take in my liked by me, which is my liked by me, and our like count, which is like count. There we go. So now if we give this quick save, it's still just saying heart, but if I just copy this code for now down to here, you're going to notice we get this actual heart icon as well as the amount of people that have liked it. And you'll notice it's not clickable. It's not a button at all. Obviously, in the case that we are logged in though, we want this to show up as a button. So here we're going to have some rather complex CSS code. Let's just get rid of everything that we have for now. I'm going to replace this with a button, and it's going to have quite a few classes on it. So this is not going to follow our normal button logic because we don't want it to be like a blue button, for example. So here we want to give it a class of group, which is kind of interesting. And also I'm going to come in here. I'm automatically going to set it up so that I can add some VS or some JavaScript code in here. So group is just allowing us to make it so when we hover this button, we can make other things happen as well. And then we're also going to come in here. We're going to center the items. So we'll say item center, a gap of 1. We're going to say self start. That's just going to make it so it starts in the right location. Obviously we need flex as well. And I want to make sure here that we have a transition on colors and a duration of 200. That's just going to be for all of our hovering related stuff. Then I need to determine what the color of everything should be based on if it is liked or not. If it is currently liked by me, well, then the text should be a red 500. Otherwise, it needs to be different styles. In our case, it needs to be a text gray of 500. The hover on this needs to be a text red of 500. And the focus visible also needs to be a text red of 500. There we go. Then from here, inside of our button, we can render out our heart icon. So we can say heart icon, just like that. Make sure I close that off. And this heart icon is also going to have its own class names. So the class names here are going to be coming just like this. The first one that we're going to have is transition on the colors, duration of 200. And then of course, if it is liked, it's going to change its color. So if it's liked by me, well, we want the fill here to be a red of 500. Otherwise, the fill is going to be a gray 500. The group hover is going to be a fill of 500. And the group focus visible is going to be a fill of red 500. There we go. So essentially what this code is doing is saying whenever I hover over or focus on this button, add these different red colors. Also, this should say fill red 500. There we go. That fixes a little bit. So now you can see when I hover, it's actually giving me a red color, which is great. The next thing I want to do is to do my span, and this span should just come in here and have my like count. So now if I give that a save and I hover, you notice the text on both of those is changing to a red color, which is great. Now, before we go ahead and actually implement all the logic for making this like button work, I want to go ahead and add in my fancy hover effects, because normally in Twitter, when you hover over these icons on the left or you hover over this, you get some really cool big hover effects, and we're actually going to implement that now. So the way we're going to implement that is by wrapping this inside of a component called icon hover effect. And we're actually going to pass a prop of red to this one because obviously we want this to show up as a red hover effect instead of gray. Now we're going to create that component, icon hover effect. And essentially all this component is going to do is add some hover, background colors. So export function icon hover effect. This is going to take in a prop, which is going to be the children that go inside of it, as well as red, which by default we're going to set to false. Icon hover props. And let's create that type. Icon hover props. I guess we called it icon hover effect props. And here we have our children, which is a React node. And then we have red, which is optional, and it is a Boolean. Make sure this is a type import. And here we can return just a simple div. And this div is really just going to be a bunch of classes, and inside of it, we're going to return our children. So here, I want it to be a circle, so we'll say rounded full. Padding here is going to be 2. We're going to transition it on the colors, and their duration is going to be 200. The final thing is I want to add in all of my color classes. So this is my color classes. Const color classes, and this is where we just check to see if it's red or not red, and we determine what we return here. So if we are in the red case, well, we want to do specific things. For example, I want my outline to be a red 400. Hover is going to be a red background as well. Group hover, in case we are using groups, is going to also be the exact same background, red 200. Same thing with group focus. That is going to be a background of red 200. And then finally, if our focus is visible on its own, we need to do the exact same background, red 200. There we go. Now I'm going to copy this, paste it down, and everywhere that we have red, I'm just going to replace that with gray. There we go. So that should be all we need to do. So now in here, we can actually import this. Let's see if it actually works. If we hover over our icon, you can see we get this really big, cool hover effect. You'll notice though it actually offset our icon by a bit. So on our button, let's just say we're going to have a negative margin on the left of 2, and that brings it back in line. Also, now that we have these cool hover effects, let's go over to our side nav and actually implement some of these. So we have our LI, we have our link. Inside of that link, I want to essentially do a bunch of things. So first of all, I want to have that icon hover effect, just like that. So at the very least, when I hover over this, you can see I get that pill shape right there, but I want to make this look better than just that. I also want to have a icon, so we can have a span here. The span here is going to say class name, flex, it's going to be items in the center, and we're going to set a gap of 4. And inside of here, I'm going to put that text of home, which I'm actually going to put inside of its own span, class name here, which is going to be hidden by default on the smaller screen sizes. The text is going to be larger, and on bigger screen sizes, I'm going to make it so that this will actually show up. The reason I am doing that is so that, let me just get this in the right place here, so that we only show an icon on the smaller screen sizes instead of this big text. So in our case, we're going to use the VSC home icon, and we're going to set it to be a height of 8 and a width of 8, just like that. Close that off, and let's see if it'll let me automatically import that. There we go. So now if we give that a save, you can see our home icon is showing up right there. And if we're on a smaller screen size, you're noticing it, just shows the icon instead of actually showing the text as well. But on a larger screen size, you can see it shows the text and the icon. So let's just shrink that down a little bit. I'm going to do the exact same thing for the rest of them. So I'm just going to copy this over, paste this down. Our link here is exactly the same. So let's just make sure we put that on the outside. There we go. Our text should say profile here, and this should be essentially an account icon. There we go. So let's just come in here, update that, click save, and now you can see we have our account icon and our home icon, which is great. I'm going to copy this exact same effect. I'm going to put it inside of our button for login. There we go. But I'm going to make it a little bit different, and that's because I'm going to change my color here to a green color. So we're going to say green 700. I'm going to copy this, make it so that the text here is a green, and I'm going to say that this is log in. Give that a save. That looks great, but obviously we don't have it done for log out. So I'm going to copy this whole thing and do it for log out as well. Put it right in there. This will say log out. And instead of green, we're going to use red. So now you can see we have that log out. This should obviously be a different icon though. This should be the sign out icon. Oops. Update that import. And this should be the VSC sign in icon. There we go. So now you can see we have the log out icon. And if I click on that, you can see it logs me out. And if I click on this, you can see it brings me to the login page. So all of that is working as we expect it to. Another thing I've noticed is in our profile icon here, we just have null being shown as our fallback. Obviously, we should probably make it show something. So here we can use the VSC account icon. So let me make sure I import that real quick. Automatically close that off. And for here, class names, we're going to set H to full and W to full. So it just fills the entire height and the width. So if we, for some reason, don't have an icon, it's going to show this instead. And actually, I put this in the wrong location. There we go. So now it's just going to fall back to this if we don't have an image. So if we just flop this right here, you'll notice it gives us those fallback icons. If I make sure I spell everything right, you can see it fills the full space. That is great. So now to truly test if this infinite scroll is working, I'm just going to add a bunch of tweets. So we're just going to say like this, that. I'm just going to add a bunch of them. There we go. So now we have a ton of tweets being added to our page. If I give it a refresh, it should only download the first 10 of our tweets. And if we scroll to the bottom, you're going to notice it's loading more tweets, and now I can scroll even further until we get to the very end where we have all of our tweets being shown. So our infinite scrolling is working, as well as our sticky sidebar and our sticky header, which is great. So now what we can do is actually make it so when we click on this button, it actually does something, because right now it does nothing. So inside of our tweet router here, we have our infinite feed. We also have the ability to create. What we need to do next is add the ability to actually toggle a like. So we'll say toggle like. This is going to be a protected route since you must be logged in to do this. For our input, this is just going to be an object. Here we go. I cannot spell object. There we go, object. And this object is going to take in a single property, which is a string. There we go. So now we have our object set up. Let's get our function. I'll just copy this directly from here. There we go. And this is just an ID. There we go, close that off. And inside of here, all I want to do is first get the information for our tweet. So we'll say that our existing tweet is equal to awaiting ctx.prisma.like, because I want to find my likes, and I want to find a unique like based on the properties here, where, and here I have a user ID tweet combination, and I'm going to just pass that in as data. And that's because up here, I'm going to say data is equal to tweet ID, which is set to our ID, and our user ID, which is our context.session.user.id. There we go. And that's because I'm going to use this information lower down. So here, this should actually really be called existing like, because I'm checking to see if I have a like that exists for this tweet. If I do have an existing like, or if I guess let's do first if I don't. So if my existing like is null, then we'll do one thing. Otherwise, we'll do something else. So if it does not exist, I need to create one. So I'll say ctx.prisma.like.create, and I'll pass it in that data just like that. And that data is just essentially the IDs. Then I can return down to my client that I added a like, so I'll set that to true. There we go. Otherwise, I want to delete it. So I'm just going to copy the exact same thing. And here I'll say delete. I'm going to delete where my user ID tweet combination is equal to that data right there. There we go. And then my added like is going to be set to false here since I deleted one instead of adding one. So now we can go down to our client where we have that infinite scrolling. And here we can actually use that inside of our tweet card. So what I can do is I can say we have toggle like, which is API dot, whoops, make sure I import that, dot tweet dot toggle like dot use mutation. Looks like I accidentally made it a query instead of a mutation. This should be a mutation. There we go. Now if we go back to here, now we could use that mutation. Then I can create a simple function, which is handle toggle like, and we can just say toggle like dot mutate, and I can pass it in the ID. There we go. I can pass this along to our heart button. So we can set in an on click here. We can also do an is loading state, which is just going to be toggle like dot is loading. Whoops, is loading. There we go. So here is loading is a Boolean. On click is a function that returns void. There we go. So now we can have is loading on click. And for our button, we can just say disabled is equal to is loading, and our on click is equal to on click. There we go. So that's just hooking those up. So now when I click on something to like it, it should actually toggle that like. And if I do a refresh, you can see that it actually did toggle that like for me, which is great. Now I just need to make it so it works without me refreshing the page. And there's many ways to do that, but I'll just show you one of them. So we'll just set up an odd success here. So when we have a successful request back to us, it should pass us some information on if we added a like or not. So we can just say if added like, we can do one thing or the other thing. For now, I don't even need this information. And instead what I can do is I can actually use a different hook. This is coming from API, and what we want to do is use context. And this is going to give us TRPC utils, essentially some utility functions to make it so that we can refresh our data. We can just say TRPC utils dot, and what I want to do is I want to get the tweet section. I want to get our infinite feed, and I just want to invalidate it. So I'm just going to say invalidate just like that. I want to make sure I await this and make sure that this is an async function. There we go. And now if I just come over here and I toggle this, you can see it's going to unlike it and like it, and it's going to refresh that data for me automatically. So what happens is essentially, as soon as this is successful, it invalidates all of my current data and refreshes all of my data. This is not ideal though, and instead we should just update our data in place. So I'll show you how to do that as well. So first of all, we can get rid of this await because we don't need that anymore. And instead here, I can say set infinite data. And inside of here, I'm going to pass it the params that I pass, which in our case is an empty object. And then I can pass it a function. I'm going to call this update data. The reason for that is because we're going to have multiple different functions and ways to call this, and I want to update all of them anytime I toggle any like at all. So this update data function, we can just call up here, update data. This is going to be a function, and I actually want the type of this function to be based on the parameters of this function right here. So I'm going to get the type of this, just like that, and I want to get essentially the second parameter. So we'll say parameters of 1, just like that. So essentially, this has the exact same type as the function that I passed as the second parameter to this function here. Then what I can do is I can say that this is equal to a function, and this is going to take in the old data. So essentially what our current cache looks like. If we have nothing in our current cache, so if our old data is equal to null, then just don't do anything, return immediately. Now, otherwise, what I need to do is update our actual data and return the new version. So first, I'm going to create a variable called count modifier. That's going to be equal to, if I added a like, I'm going to increase my count by 1, otherwise I'll decrease it by 1. Then I'm going to essentially return all of my old data, just exactly as is. But I want to change some things. For example, my old data.pages, I want to change certain pages. So we'll say old data.pages. I want to map through each page inside of my old data. And here, I just want to return the page exactly as it is. So for the most part, I don't want to change anything, but I do want to change the tweets. So I want to get my tweets, and I want to map through those as well. Essentially, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to find the exact tweet that I changed. So here, if my tweet.id is equal to the ID of the thing I'm trying to modify, well, this one I want to change. Essentially, I want to keep all the data exactly as it is, but I want to change the like count by taking the current like count, and I want to change it based on my modifier, so increase it or decrease it by 1, and it's going to be liked by me whether or not I added a like or not. So if I added a like, now change this to true, otherwise change it to false. Otherwise, don't change my tweet, return it exactly as it is. So now with all of that done, this is some fairly complicated code, but really all it's doing, and I get rid of this async here, is all that this code is doing is it's saying update the data where the exact tweet that I clicked on is, and make sure I update it to whatever the new data is for that tweet. So now if I click here, you notice it doesn't have to refresh my data, but there's a little bit of a problem going on, it looks like. I'm going to refresh my page just to make sure. Click on this one, and you can see it's still not quite working. Now, if I dig into the data to see what the problem is, it looks like I said page instead of pages here. That's my only issue, I think. So now if I click on this, you'll notice it automatically removes it. And the nice thing is it doesn't have to refetch my data. It just keeps all the data. So you'll notice if I have a bunch of tweets showing on the page, and I change this one to have a heart, you'll notice it doesn't have to refetch any of those tweets. They all just stay inside the cache. Now, I essentially want to do similar logic with our new tweet so that if we type in something here and click tweet, it's going to show up instead of actually making us wait, because now I had to refresh and then, show the information like this. So I'm going to make it so it automatically shows the information. If we go to our form here, right here is our on success where we have our new tweet information. We're going to reset our input, but now what I want to do is that same exact thing I did before. So I'm going to get those trpc utils, and that's just equal to API dot, I don't want to use that context hook. So now I can say trpc utils, I want to get tweet, I want to get the infinite feed here. And what I want to do is I want to set the data just like I did before. And this is the infinite data. Again, no props. And this is going to take in our old data. So if our old data equals null, or for some reason our old data.pages of 0 equals null, like we don't have any data for the first page, then return. Because essentially I'm just trying to put data on my first page. Otherwise, what I want to do inside of here is I want to get my new cached tweet. So I'll say new cache tweet is equal to, I'm just going to take everything that's in my new tweet that we have, and then I want to update some other information. For example, I need to specify the like count to be 0, because this new tweet doesn't have all the information I need. It only has some of it. So I also want to change the liked by me to be false, because I haven't liked it yet. And then I need to specify the user information. So we're going to have our ID, which is our session.data.user.id. And you'll notice this could be null, which is obviously not ideal. So I'm just going to put a quick check here to say if my session.status is not equal to authenticated, then what I want to do is I just want to return And this should be impossible to hit. There should be no scenario where I'm not authenticated and I also created a tweet. So this should be pretty much impossible to hit, which is why I just put this return here, because really this should never happen. But now it ensures that our user ID here exists. We're going to do the same thing with our name, session.data.user.name, and the same thing with our image, just like that. So now we have our new tweet created. Now we just need to insert it into our old data. So down here, we can do a return. And what I want to do is I want to return an object that has all of my old data. And I want to loop through my pages. Whoops. And I essentially want to keep all my pages exactly the same. So I'm going to say old data, but I want to get my pages. And I want to actually slice it. Here we go, dot slice. And I want to get all the pages after the first. So the first page I'm not going to return. This is just every page except for the first. And here I want to actually define my first page to be this. So here, I'm just going to take all the data that was originally at the first page and place it there. And I want to overwrite what my tweets were. Essentially, I just want to add my new tweet to the beginning of my tweet array. So I can say my old data, or sorry, my new tweet goes here. And then my old data dot pages of 0. I want to get the tweets from that. There we go. And I'm going to spread that out just like that. Now right there, that should hopefully clean that all up. And the great thing is whenever this is successful, it's going to push my new tweet to the beginning of the first page. Essentially it'll be right here. So if I type in, hit tweet, that page or that tweet gets added right there. Create something else, hit tweet, it gets added to the very start. And all the rest of this still works just fine with no errors. I can like these tweets and they work just like I expect. Now really the last thing to do on this page is to be able to determine if we want to show all of the recent tweets or if we only want to show the tweets of the people that we are currently following. So if we go back to this page here, we make sure we actually fix some of these errors. You can see this says type boolean undefined and it's not assignable. So what we need to do here is just make sure that this is or null. That should hopefully fix that error. Actually, it looks like it did not. Let me take a quick look here. We'll open that up. Obviously, this should be boolean or undefined. There we go. And then here, this looks like there's some errors as well. Let's see where those are. Right here, it's just saying that our old data is not returning the right properties and information. Yeah, so essentially here, I just need to change this to or null because they're technically null or undefined, but old data expects them to be null and not undefined. So that fixed that error. And then this has more. We specify that as or null. Still doesn't fix our error. Let's just read it and see what it is real quick. The expected type comes from property, blah, blah, blah. Type undefined is not assignable to type a boolean. So let's go to where we have that being defined. Whoops. Oh yeah, that's for our infinite scroll. So this must be a boolean. So we'll just say or false. There we go. That'll fix that for us. And I think I can actually make this easier by just saying this is equal to false by default. That should hopefully make it so that down here, I don't need to do that. There we go. That's perfect. So now, as I was saying, let's go back to this page. We want to be able to show recent tweets, or we want to be able to show the people that you are following. So we want to be able to show some tabs. And these tabs are going to be inside of our header right here. And we only want to show this for people that are logged in, because if you're not logged in, you aren't following anyone, so it doesn't make sense. So here, we have our session, which we need to make sure we get. Use session, just like that. So if our session.status is not equal to authenticated, then obviously we're not going to show this. But if it is equal to authenticated, then we're going to show this information. There we go. And we're just going to have a div, which is going to be using Flexbox because I love Flexbox. It's great for everything. And then we can actually loop through all of our tabs. So to handle our tabs, we're going to come up here. We're going to create a variable called tabs, and we're going to have a tab for recent, and we're going to have a tab for following. And we're going to set this as a constant variable because we can then create some state for our selected tab. And for setting our selected tab equal to use state. There we go. And by default, I just want this to be recent. But what I can do is I can specify the type here. And instead of just specifying it as a string array, really I want it to be either recent or following. So what I can do is I can say type of tabs, just like that. And I want to be able to get only the things that are numbers from them, just like that. By doing that, I'm essentially saying get each type based on the index. And I need to make sure I wrap that in parentheses. Now, if I hover over my use state, you can see it has a type of recent or following. And that's great because that means I can only specify my selected tab as one of these two values. So now when I loop through each one of my tabs, we got a map here for each tab. I can do a return. And this return is going to return a button element. And this button has a key, which is just our tab. I know that's going to be unique. And then we need to have a lot of classes on here. So for this, there we go. We're going to have a flex grow, padding of 2. Hover is going to be a background gray of 200. And the focus visible is going to be the exact same thing, background gray 200. Make sure I put a colon here. And then I need to add some custom styles based on if it is selected. So if the tab is equal to my selected tab, that means it is currently the tab that I'm on. So I want to have a border on the bottom, which is going to be quite wide. And I'm going to make it blue. And I'm going to change my font to bold as well. Otherwise, just do nothing at all. There we go. So inside the button, we can just say tab. And on click, whoops, we can set the selected tab to that tab. Now, if I give that a quick save, you can see we have our recent and our following. The one that's selected has a big underline. And if I click over here, you can see it goes to the following tab and so on. That is working exactly as I expect. I obviously need to show different things based on what tab I'm on though. So down here, if my selected tab is equal to recent, and then I'm going to show the recent ones. Otherwise, I'm going to render a new component called following tweets. There we go. And that's going to be very similar to this function right here. So I'm just going to copy this, paste it down. There we go. Make sure I close this off. And now we have our recent tweets and our following tweets. And for now, they both render exactly the same thing, but we can change that because this use infinite query we can take some parameters. For example, I can just give it the simple parameter of only following, set that to true. There we go. And now whenever I have this query defined, if I go to where that is actually defined at, here we go. In my input, I can make it take an optional only following parameter, which is going to be a z.boolean. And it's going to be optional. So inside of here, I can say only following defaults to false. And now I can use that to actually make it so this query will either return only the people you're following or to return everyone. So to make this easier, because I'm also going to have another infinite feed for my profile, I'm going to break this out into a function called get infinite tweets. There we go. We'll just return null for now. And this function is going to take a few things. We're going to have a where clause. That's like the main thing that changes. I need my context. I need my limit. And I need my cursor, just like that. Now we can specify the props of these things by coming in here. We can say that our where clause is optional, and it's going to be a prisma.tweet where input. There we go. Make sure I import Prisma. There we go. And this is just the where input for a tweet. Super straightforward. It comes from Prisma, which is great. My limit is a number. My cursor, we know that that is an ID, which is string. And a created at, which is a date. And it could also be undefined. And then finally, we have our context, which we can actually get by using the infer async return type, custom type here. This is really useful for getting a async return type. I want to get that from the type of create trpc context. And this is something that's already defined for us. And essentially this just gives us the type of our context. And by inferring the return type, we're just able to infer what that actual context is going to be. When I hover, you can see we get session and Prisma. Now inside this function, I essentially want to take all the code that we have inside this query here. And I want to just put all of that inside of there. So I'm just going to copy all of that, place it directly into here. There we go. And hopefully if we did everything correctly, it looks like it's working. I should just make this an async function. And then we just put in our where, which is our where clause. There we go. Now everything is working fine. We can just come all the way up to here where we originally were calling this. And we can return calling get infinite tweets. And we'll just await that for now. And we just need to pass in all of our information. So our limit, our context, our cursor, and there we go. Make sure await is spelled correctly. And now all we need to do is use this only following to determine what our where clause is going to look like. So first I need to get our user. So const current user ID is context.session.user.id. There we go. And our where clause, if our current user equals null, or we are not getting the people that we only follow, then essentially I don't want to return any where clause. The reason for that is I want to just keep everything exactly as it was before. So if I give this quick save, this is just saying, if we are not logged in, or we're just getting all the recent tweets and I don't care about following information, just don't return any where clause, just get all the data like we were before. Otherwise, I want to get a where clause. I want to check my user, and I want to check their followers. And I'm essentially saying if some of the followers have the ID of my current user, then I want to return the tweets from those users. So essentially, if a particular user tweeted something and you are following them, return those tweets and only those tweets. So now this is only going to return to me the people I am following. So if I come back to here, it looks like everything's working. And if I click on this following tab, you're going to notice there are absolutely no tweets at all showing up. And that's because I'm not following anybody, which is great. This recent tab is working and the following tab is also working. You're also going to notice if I do a refresh here real quick, that the actual loading bar, it doesn't have a loading indicator. It just has that loading text. So let's fix that now. I'm going to create a custom component. We're going to call it loading spinner.tsx, export function loading spinner. There we go. And inside of here, all we're going to do is have one prop called big, which by default is false. Loading spinner props. There we go. And this is just so we can have a larger spinner if we want. There we go. So I can have my size classes. So if it is big, then we're just going to have a width of 16 and a height of 16. Otherwise, we're going to have a width of 10 and a height of 10. Then we can just return a simple div. This is going to be really easy. We have a div inside of here. We're going to have the VS Code refresh icon. Make sure, let me see if it lets me import that automatically. It does not, it looks like. So we'll just import that manually. From React icons /VSC. And this is going to be the refresh icon. There we go. I guess it's just called refresh, not refresh icon. And this is going to have a class name. Animate spin. And I want it to be based on the size. And then for our div here, I'm just going to center it essentially. So flex, justify, center, and padding too. So this is just going to be animated, and this is called size classes. So it's going to be either big or small, and it's just going to spin in a circle. So now if we refresh our page, and we make sure we actually use this instead of the text loading. So anywhere I have the text loading, I just want to replace that. So see here, loader, this should use my loading spinner. There we go. And then let's see where else we're using that text loading. I think that's the only place we're using it for now. So let's just refresh. It's like it's actually not working like I expect. And that is because it looks like I missed one of them right here. I thought there was more than one. So loading spinner. There we go. So now if I refresh, you can see we get that loading spinner, which is great. We go under following, get the same exact loading spinner. That's exactly what we want. And to make sure everything works, if we log out, you'll notice those tabs don't show up. The loading spinner still works. We can't like any of these tweets, which is exactly what we want. But as soon as we log back in, we can then actually like all the different tweets that we have. So here, we can go ahead and like this. We can unlike this one. We can only look at our followers and so on. So now with that all done, we're finally ready to move on to actually doing the profile page, which luckily will be quite a bit easier. Let's do export function profile page. And actually, we should make this a const profile page. And that's because we want to use the next page type, just like that. So we can set that equal to a arrow function. There we go. That's going to work. And now we can just, for example, return an H1 that says profile. There we go. And now if I go to someone's profile by clicking this profile button right here, and I make sure that this is an export. So we'll say export default profile page. There we go, you can see it just says profile. And it's the same thing if I click on a link here to go to someone's specific profile. Now on this profile page, we have a lot of stuff we want to render. So let's just start straight away with the JSX. First of all, I want to render some things inside of the head. So in the head, I want to change the title of our page. So normally the title is Twitter clone, but I want to make this say Twitter clone. But I also want to be able to show the actual profile user's name. So I essentially want to have the profile.name or the user.name in our case. So how exactly are we going to do that? Well, there are a few ways for us to do this. The best way to do it is either just server-side render the entire page or to use some type of incremental static site generation. In our case, I'm going to opt for the static site generation because the actual information we're going to be querying doesn't change that often. And when it does, we can just revalidate the page. For example, the user's name or image does not change that often. So to do this static site generation stuff that I'm talking about, first of all, we need to export an async function called get static props, just like that. And this is going to take in a context, which is going to be coming from the get static paths context prop here. And in our case, we're going to be passing in the ID of a string. And the reason for that is because we have our ID as our actual dynamic property based on the ID name we gave that TSX file. So that's just based on our routing information. And inside of here, we can just say our ID is equal to context.params.id. We can make sure that everything is working. It looks like we have some errors. Get static props has no await. That's fine. We aren't actually awaiting anything. That's perfectly okay. And here we can just say if ID equals null. So for some reason we don't have an ID, well, I just want to redirect the user back to the main page. So we'll redirect them, redirect them to our destination, which is going to be a slash like that. Otherwise, what I want to do is I want to get something called an SSG, which is going to be a server-side generation helper. So I'm going to call SSG helper. And then from this, I can actually use the things on TRPC. But first, we need to get this SSG helper. All this SSG helper allows us to do is to prefetch some data automatically and render it to our page. So if we go down into our server section and we come in here, we can just say that we want to create a new file inside this API folder. And this is going to be called ssghelper.ts. And inside of here, we just want to export a function called ssghelper. And this function is going to return to us creating a server-side helpers. There we go. And this is going to be coming here from TRPC. So, can make sure that we import that. Looks like it won't let me do it automatically, so I'll manually import it. Import that from at trpc/react query/server. Let's see if it lets me do it now. There we go. And what this needs to take is it needs to take our router, which we already know is our app router. That's super straightforward. It needs to take in our context, which is going to be a little bit more confusing. And then it needs to take in a transformer, which we're using super JSON. So we're just going to get super JSON like that. Import super JSON from super JSON. There we go. Now to get our context, we need to open up this TRPC file. You're going to notice there's a bunch of information inside of here, but there's this one thing called create inner context. I want to export that so we can use it in other places. Then in our SSG helper, I want to call that, create inner TRPC context. I want to pass it in a session of null, because if we're doing static side generation, we don't have any user information. So obviously our user is null. So we're passing in null here for our session. With that done, we've essentially created a TRPC helper that we can run to generate static sites for us. So if we come over here, we have that SSG helper. Let me just make sure I import that. There we go. And now I can say SSG jot, and you can see here, I can access things like a tweet, or in our case, we're going to be accessing our profile. So we need to create that profile next. So inside of our routers, let's just take our tweet router and we're going to copy it. We're going to call this one profile. Here we go. I'm going to get rid of almost everything. So this will say profile router, and we're just going to get rid of all the code inside of it. There we go. And this is just going to be closed off there. And here we're going to say get by ID, and that's going to be a public route. And we're going to specify an input, z.object. ID is a z.string. And then we're going to have a query on that, which is an async function. Let's get our input, which is an ID, our context. There we go. So this is going to be rather straightforward. I want to get my Prisma user, and I want to find a unique user based on that ID. So where our ID is the ID. And then I want to select some specific fields, and we'll make sure that we await this. And this will be our profile. There we go. So the specific fields that I want to get is the name of the user. I want to get the image of the user. And also I want to determine if this person is following this user or not. So we want to query the followers. And then I want to check to see if my current user ID equals null. So up here we can say const current user ID equals, and that's going to be from our session.user.id. So if this current user ID equals null, then don't query anything at all. We'll just return undefined. Otherwise, I want to do a query where my ID is my current user ID. So essentially what I'm saying is determine if this person is being followed by me or not. If there's no one logged in, don't do anything. Otherwise, check to see if this person has a follower with the same ID as me, so I can know if I'm following them or not. Also, I want to get some count variables. So I'll say count. Here I want to select the count for the followers, the amount of people they are following. Oops, true. As well as if they have any tweets or not, how many tweets they have. There we go. Make sure I put a comma at the end there. And now what I can do is I can use that profile information. So I can just say down here, if my profile equals null, then I just want to return, essentially return no information at all. Otherwise, I'm just going to return my information. And I want to get pretty much all the information. So my data.name, whoops, I called it profile. Profile.name, image is profile.image. I want to get my count related information. So I'll say followers count is going to be profile._count.followers. I want to get the exact same thing for my follows count, as well as my tweets count. And this is going to be follows, tweets. There we go. And then lastly, I want to determine if I am following or not. And that's going to be my profile.followers, whoops, .length is greater than 0. So this is all of the information I want to get about a particular profile. And most importantly, the information I want to get is the name, the image, as well as all the counts and if I'm following that user or not. So now we can use that information to generate an actual static HTML version of our site. So if we come back over here, we can say profile, whoops, profile dot, and it looks like this isn't giving me autocomplete, and that's because I need to make sure I do our profile router here. So I can say profile router, just like that. Now, if I go back into here, I can say get by ID, and I want to do a prefetch, and that's really important. Essentially, I'm saying prefetch all this data for statically generating my site whenever I need to. So now I can prefetch based on the specific ID that I have up here, and I can just await that right here. It doesn't actually give me back my data, but it does prefetch the data to be used on my page, and I'll show you how that works in just a second. But now, once that's done, I can come down here and I can return the props that I want to pass to my page. So I can say props, and inside of here I can pass down my ID, but I also need to pass down this thing called trpc state. And that's just equal to calling the dehydrate function on my SSG. Now I have an ID as well as this trpc state, and this trpc state essentially just allows me to make sure that I rehydrate everything on the front end without actually going out and calling the back end. It just knows what the front end information already is. Also, it looks like I have an error here. That's because this should be called getStaticProps instead of getStaticPaths. And then let me just make sure I import that. There we go. And this, I believe, needs to be able to be marked as optional because it could be null. And there we go. Then the last thing I need to do to actually generate static pages is I need to tell it what pages to generate. So I can say getStaticPaths. This is taking getStaticPaths like that. And that's just a function. And this just will return to me an object that has the paths that I want to generate, as well as my fallback for what I want to do whenever I am not able to find a page in my paths. So you'll notice for this, I actually pass an empty array. So I'm saying don't generate any pages at all by default. But whenever you try to request a page that doesn't exist, don't send down the HTML to the client until it's done generating. That's what blocking means. And then store it in the cache for later. So what I'm doing with all of this is I'm saying anytime I try to access a profile page, it'll say, okay, you know what? Have I accessed this page before? If not, generate the page using all of this information, pass that information down to my client, and then show me that actual page. And this allows me to use the server to generate, for example, my user's name before the page gets sent down to the client, which means that this title property is going to be in the HTML before it actually gets to the client, which is really good for things like SEO. Let me just make sure I come up here, make sure that these are type imports, just like that. And then what I can do is I can say inside of here, I'm going to have an ID prop. And the way I get the types for this is a little bit confusing. What I need to do is I need to pass in a generic type here of infer get static prop types. There we go, props type, sorry. And that's coming from the type of my get static props function. There we go. So essentially what I'm saying by doing this is that the props that get passed into here are coming from the return value of this function right here, which in our case has that ID property. So now we have this ID. Then what I can do using our TRPC, we can say API.profile. I want to get this by ID, and then I just want to use the query and pass in my ID. Now, the nice thing is, since we prefetched this information right here, it's automatically going to give us this information without actually having to do any queries at all. So it'll never give us a loading state. So I can just say here, that we're going to get our profile like that. And it's going to be equal to this. And then I can set this equal to our profile.name. And I should have a simple check here that if our profile is equal to null for some reason, well, that means we're on a page that doesn't exist. Obviously, we shouldn't be here. So I'm going to return some type of error page. So we'll say error page. This is coming from Next. So we'll say status code equals 404. Let me just make sure I import this. Like I need to manually import it. Go up here, import error page from Next/error. There we go. So now it's going to give me a 404 page if I go to a page that doesn't exist. Also, I should probably do this if our profile.name is equal to null as well, because obviously that's something that shouldn't happen. So I just gave my page a refresh real quick, and what I can do is after the head, I'm just going to put our profile.name just like that. So you can see it shows the name, but the really important thing is if I view the page source and just zoom this in real quick, you'll notice, first of all, in the title, it has my name, Twitter clone web dev simplified. I should probably put a hyphen between these. There we go. And also you'll notice inside of the actual body, if we scroll down, you'll see it has the actual name for web dev simplified. So unlike all my other pages, which are rendering most of their data on the client, this is actually able to get my profile on the server and send that to me. And since we're using SSG instead of using server-side props, this is actually caching this page. So the next time I access this page, it's going to be super quick because it's coming directly from the actual cache. So it's going to not have to run through all of this hydration and stuff a second time. Now, obviously, if the information we get from here changes, we're going to want to regenerate that cached page. Otherwise, it's just going to have to, slowly update itself. Like essentially what will happen is it'll show you the old data and then refresh with the new data, which is not ideal. So we'll tackle that in a bit. But for now, I just want to get the profile page working because right now it's kind of ugly. So first of all, let's do the header section. So we're going to come in here with a header. This is going to be very similar to all of our other headers. So we're going to make it sticky to the top, and we're going to give it a Z of 10 so it shows up over everything. Make it so that the items inside of it are centered, border on the bottom, background white, and we're going to give it a little bit of padding and spacing. Then inside of our header, we essentially want to have a link that allows us to go backwards. So we'll say href is equal to ... That'll just allow us to go backwards. And we'll add some classes on here for a little bit of margin on the right, just to space it out. Whoops, link, there we go. Make sure I import this. And inside of our link, I want to have this be a back button that has that cool icon hover effect. So we'll do that icon hover effect, and then we'll do a VS Code arrow left. Let's see if it lets me auto import that. There we go. And let's give this some specific sizings. We'll say H6 and W6. There we go. So now if I save, you can see we have that back button. I click it and it brings me back to this page, which is great. Next, I obviously want to put my actual profile name and image. So we'll say profile image. The source is going to be our profile.image. And for this one, I want to make sure it has the class name of flex shrink 0, just so it doesn't actually shrink down. There we go. So that way, if my page gets smaller, the image doesn't change its size. And then finally, I'm going to have my actual information for my profile and all the other profile stats. Let's put some spacing on the left, and let's make it grow. Inside of here, first of all, we're going to have my profile name. There we go. Give it some classes. Text large and font bold. There we go. You can see we have our profile name. And then below that, we're going to have all the information for our tweets and followers and so on. So let's make this slightly muted. We'll say text gray 500. And then inside of here, essentially I want to have my profile and I want to get the followers count. Or let's get the tweets count first. There we go. Tweets count. And I want to just display that as a number. Then afterwards, I want to have a space. And below that, we can come in here, and I'm going to use a function that we're just going to create up here called getPlural. There we go. And actually, I'm just going to put that down below. There we go. Just so it's a little bit below the actual important code. And this function is going to be very simple. It's going to take in a number. It's going to take in a singular version of a word. And it's going to take in the plural version of a word. And then all I'm going to do is based on if it's plural or not, I'm going to return the singular or plural version. So we can use the plural rules, which comes from intl dot plural rules. There we go. And then what I can just do is I can say return the plural rules dot select, And I want to select based on the number. And this is going to return to me a few things. You can see it's going to say few, many, one, other, two, or zero. In our case, I'm only doing English. So it's going to be, is this one or not? If it's one, return the singular word. Otherwise, return the plural word. Sure, this is a question mark. And now essentially what I'm saying is give me either a singular or a plural version based on the number. And if I use that up here, I can say get plural, pass it in my tweet count. So I can say tweet count. There we go. And I could say it's either going to be tweet or it's going to be tweets. Now you can see since we have 15 tweets, it shows up as a plural. But if I change this to say one, you can now see it says tweet instead of tweets, just like I would expect. There we go. Now I also want to do a there, and I want to essentially get another one of these. So I'll put that at the bottom. I'm just going to copy this exactly, paste it down 2 more times. One time here is going to be for my followers. This is going to say followers and followers. There we go. And then this one is for the followers count, or the follows count, sorry. And this one is going to be my follows count. But in our case, we actually don't need the get plural here. And the reason for that is because there is no plural version of follows. It's just follows. Actually, it's going to be following, sorry. There we go. So there's no like 0 followings. It's just following either way. So that's why we're going to leave it as is. So now you can see we have 0 followers, 0 people that we're following, and 15 total tweets. Now the final thing I want to add inside of this section is going to be a button for following someone. So I'm going to say follow button. And inside of here, I'm going to pass along is following, which we know we already have is following like this. I'm going to pass along the user ID, which is just our ID. And then finally, I'm going to pass along an onClick function, which for now, we're just going to make do nothing. There we go. And we can just say null, just like that. And then finally, the very last thing I want to do inside the main section here is I want to have that infinite list of tweets. So infinite tweet list, just like that. And I'm going to pass along a bunch of information. First of all, though, we need to create our follow button. And we're just going to return in H1 that says follow. For now, doesn't really matter. And now what I want to do is I want to go into our routes and I want to create a new route that's going to be for getting a particular feed that's going to be for not just an infinite feed, but an infinite feed for a profile. So we're going to say infinite profile feed. This is going to be a public procedure. And it's going to be very similar to what we have here. So I'm going to copy the input. I'm going to paste that in. But instead of having an only following, we're going to have a user ID. This user ID is just going to be a string. So we have a required user ID that we pass along. Otherwise, everything else is going to be pretty much the same. I can actually copy a lot of this code right here. So actually, let's just copy the entire .query. There we go. Paste down that query. There we go. And inside the query, I know that I have this user ID. There we go. And my where clause is going to be quite a bit different. So we can clear that up a little bit. This where clause, I just want to get where the user ID is the particular user ID. Also, it looks like I forgot to close this off with a parenthesis. There we go. And then let me just make sure I have everything else closed off properly. Looks like I'm missing one parenthesis there and a comma there possibly. No, that's not what I'm missing at all. That goes to there. That's fine. That's fine. This needs a comma. And actually, this parenthesis needs to be removed. That's where the comma needs to go. And that looks like it cleaned everything up. So essentially, I just created a brand new infinite tweet query, and the where clause is just checking where the user is the particular user. So I'm just checking for one user's tweets, and that's it. Now, if we go back to that profile page, we can actually get all that tweet information. So let's go up here. First of all, I should probably wrap this like that so it's a little bit easier to read. We can just say const tweets is equal to api.tweet.infinite profile feed. There we go. .use infinite query. And here I pass along my user ID. And then I need to obviously get my next page param. So based on my last page, this is going to be my last page .next cursor. There we go. That's getting all of my different tweets. Now I can pass all that information down to here. Now what I pass into this is going to look pretty much identical to what I passed into my other infinite list. So I'm going to go over to that page. I'm just going to copy all of this right here. I'm going to paste that into here. And that should hopefully just be everything I need, and it maps everything up perfectly. Now it looks like some of my CSS styles are a little bit off. Let's see. It looks like this main here should be outside the header. Now if I save, that looks like it cleaned it up drastically. Also, my follow button looks like it needs to be moved out one level. That way it's off to the right-hand side. And you can see as I scroll, it's infinitely loading just like I expect it to. And I can still do the liking and unliking just like before. One thing you'll notice though, if I do a refresh here real quick, and I like this tweet or unlike it, you'll notice it doesn't actually unlike until I refresh. The reason for that is I'm not invalidating this. So if I go back to my infinite tweet thing here, and I go to wherever I have my liking related code, here it is. You can see I'm doing it for my infinite feed. I need to also do it for my infinite feed where I'm doing only the followers. And I need to do the exact same thing for my feed here where I'm doing it for the profile. So it's going to be infinite profile feed. And the infinite profile feed is going to be for the user ID. And that user ID is going to be the user ID of whatever the ID of the tweet is, the user ID for the tweet. So user.id. So I'm just refreshing all of that user's tweets as well. So now if I click on this heart, you'll notice it actually works just like I expect it to. So now let's go ahead and actually make it so that we can follow users, because that would be great. Let's create that follow button, or I guess we've already created it. Let's make it work. First of all, we have our user ID is following, and on click, this is going to be our follow. Actually, let's just define it inline. It's fine. User ID is a string, is following. That's a Boolean, and on click, it's just a function and I don't care what it returns, so we'll use void like that. Then what I can do here is I can return a button. Just like that. And first of all, I want to check to see our session. So I can say const session equals use session. And if our session.status is not equal to authenticated, then we're just going to return null. Also, if my session.data.user.id is equal to the current user ID, well, obviously I should return null in that case as well. And essentially the reason I'm doing that is because obviously I don't want to be able to follow myself. That doesn't make any sense. So for our button, let's add an on click here. So we'll say on click. That on click is just going to be our on click. It's just going to get passed along. We want to use a small button. We want this one to be gray if we are already following the user. That way it kind of has a more muted tone if you're already following them. Let's go ahead and also make sure we import our button just like that. It looks like I spelled gray wrong. There we go. Now inside of here, if we are following them, well, what I want to do is I just want to have the text say unfollow. Otherwise, it'll say follow, just like that. Super straightforward. Now if I save and I come over here, you'll notice I don't see any button because this is my own user. But if I log out and log in as a different user, which I'll do real quick. Here we go. I'm logging in as a brand new user here. This one's just called test WDS user. If I authorize this as my user, now you can see that I can go to the home page. I can create a tweet as this new user and it's showing up in the list and I can like it just like these tweets, which is great. But if I go to this list, you can see I can see my profile. But if I go to this other profile, I can see this profile and I can click this follow button. Right now it does nothing though. So let's go ahead and actually create a way to follow. Well, we need to do that inside the profile here. We can just kind of minimize this down. We can say toggle follow. That is going to be a protected procedure. We're going to get our input here, which is a z.object. And we just want to get the user ID of the person we want to follow. And then what we want to do is we want to make this a mutation. Whoops. Dot mutation. This is an async function. Our input has a user ID. We have our context. And then we have all the stuff we want to do inside of here. So first, let's get our current user ID, context.session.user.id, and then we need to get the existing follower. So we can say existing follow equals, and I want to await my Prisma call to the user table. And I want to find essentially the first one. I want to find the first one where the ID is my user ID. So I want to get the user based on the user ID. I want to check the followers, followers to see if some of the followers have the ID, which is the current user ID. Essentially, I only want to get a user with this particular user ID if they are already being followed by me. So that's going to be my existing follow. And then I can just say if existing follow equals null, then I want to do something. I want to add a follower. Otherwise, I want to remove one. So here, I can await ctx.prisma.user, and I actually need to call update here, which is a little bit weird, but I don't have a followers table, so I need to update the user itself. I want to get the user where my ID is my user ID, and I want to add a follower, so I can say data I want to add a follower. So my followers, I want to connect, which allows me to add an actual row, an ID of current user ID. There we go. And I want to do the exact same thing down here, but instead of connect, I want to disconnect that user. So essentially remove them from the follower list. Then here, I'm just going to create a variable called added follower. We'll say added follow, and we're going to set that equal to nothing at first. Here, added follow equals true. Here, it equals false. And then below here, I'm going to return that as an object. Now, the reason I'm doing it this way, as opposed to how I did it in this one, where if we scroll down a little ways, I was just returning it in line, is because I'm actually going to do some other stuff in between here to deal with revalidation. If you remember, we statically generated the follower count. So if we don't actually do any revalidation here, it's always going to give them the 0 follower count. Even if they have 100 followers, if the first time the page was generated, they had 0 followers, it'll always return that HTML and then always have to re-update. So if we do some revalidation here, we can make sure we say, hey, the old version is no longer valid, re-update it with the new version. And we're gonna have to do that every time they create a tweet or every time they are followed or unfollowed. So for now, we're not gonna worry about that because we're just gonna go to our profile page and we're actually going to make it so that we can make this work. So when we click on the follow button, it actually follows the user. So all the way up here, we can go ahead and do that. We can call this toggle follow. And that's going to be equal to api.profile.togglefollow.useMutation. We have the on success that we can set up if we want, and that's just going to have our data, which is going to be, what do we call this, added follow. There we go. Make sure that's correct. There it is. And inside of here, we can do all of our revalidation when we get to that point. But for now, we can actually use this all the way down here in our follow button. So we can say on click is just going to call toggle follow.mutate. And we can pass it in that ID. So let's see here, user ID is our ID. Also, we should probably pass in an is loading state here, which is just going to be toggle follow.isLoading. We can use that down here. Say is loading is a Boolean, and we can make sure our button is disabled if it is loading. There we go. Looks like we have an error, comma right there, and that fixed all those problems. So now hopefully if we've done everything correctly and we click follow, it'll actually follow that user. You'll notice it doesn't update anything yet, but when I refresh, you'll see that my follower account has changed and I now have the unfollow button. Now I just need to make sure I update that information inside of here to actually change my cache. So again, we need to get those trpc utils. So trpc utils equals api.useContext. Here trpc utils dot, and what I want to do is get my profile. I want to get that by ID, and I want to set my data for the particular ID here, and I want to take my old data, old data, just like that. And here, if my old data is null for some reason, just return, don't change anything. There we go. And then const, I want to get my count modifier just like we did before. So that's if I added a follower, increase it by 1, otherwise decrease it by 1. And then finally, I want to take all my old data and spread it out just like I did before. Old data, my is following is going to be changed to added follower, or added follow, sorry. And then my count here, so my followers count, there we go, is going to be changed by that amount. So I can say old data.follows count is just going to be added by that count modifier. There we go. So now if I unfollow, you can see the button is changed back to follow and my follows has been changed to 0. Now if I click follow here and we go back to the home page and I go to my following, you can see it only shows tweets from this user and it doesn't show this tweet, for example. It only shows the ones from the people I'm following, which is great. Now there was one minor problem though. If we go back to this user's page, you're going to notice it says one follower here, but if I inspect the page source and I just do a quick line wrap here and I search for follower, you can see it says 0 followers right here. Actually, no, it says 1 follower. Now, technically that is correct and that 1 follower is right, but the problem is that in development, it's always hitting my static site and regenerating the page, but in production, it doesn't actually do that for me. So if I were to deploy this to production and I try to hit this page, I'll actually show you what I'm talking about by just saying git add, git commit, add changes. There we go. And we'll just push this. It doesn't really matter. This is just to show you exactly what I'm talking about. So now we have this pushed up to production. And if we come over to here, we can actually try to view our project. And if I come down here, I can click on the project and it's trying to access it, essentially saying it's dangerous, probably because I have Twitter clone in the title, which is not really what you want to have in a title, but we're just going to say visit the unsafe site. And of course, it's not quite updated yet. Let's go to my deployments here. Let's see, it's currently building. So once this finishes building, we should be able to see it. So I'll come back to you once that's done. There we go, it just finished building. If I refresh this here, you can see we have our Twitter application, which is great. Now let's just say I tweet something and I tweet something else. And now I'm gonna log out and log in as another user real quick. There we go, I logged in as this other user. Let's just create a couple tweets. And I'm gonna come to this user and I'm gonna click the follow button. So now they have 1 follower. If I refresh the page, you're gonna notice that it originally said 0 tweets, 0 followers. You see that 0 tweets, 0 follower. And if I inspect the page source, of course, Chrome is yelling at me. Let's just visit the page and I search for follower. You can see 0 followers, 0 tweets. And that's because I created this page statically the very first time I accessed it. And then I'm never refreshing it. So it's always serving me the static version that has 0 tweets and 0 followers. I need to invalidate the old version so that next time I access it, it gets me the correct data. So let's go ahead and do that now. We actually have that set up right here, this revalidation. So in order to do this, what we need to do is we need to go over to this TRPC section here where we have this create inner TRPC context. And we also have this right here. What we want to do is we want to pass it a revalidate SSG, which is just res.revalidate. This is a function that comes directly from this response object of Next. Now in this function here, I can make sure I take that in as part of my context here. So revalidate SSG, and that's just going to be null, or it's going to be that revalidate function. The best way to get the type for that is I can just come over here, I can hover over this, and I can just essentially copy this exact type. I'll come up here, paste it down, and we're going to put that or inside of there and make sure I wrap all this in parentheses. There we go. So that actually gave me the type for this. So now here I have my revalidate SSG, which is ops.revalidate SSG. There we go. So all of that is working fine. I just have one error here. I need to make sure I pass along that revalidate SSG, which in our case is just going to be null. There we go. So now all that is working, and we should have access to this revalidate SSG anytime that we're not on the actual SSG helper. So inside of here, what we can do is context.revalidate SSG, and this just takes essentially a path that we want to revalidate. So in our case, we want to go to the /profiles/ and I want to get user ID. I want to do the exact same thing for my current user ID. Because anytime that I access this page, and this could be null, so I want to make sure I do that check here. And also, I don't care about waiting for this, so I'm just going to put void at the end here. So that means just don't wait for this to finish at all. But essentially what I'm saying here is anytime that someone is followed, first revalidate the page of the person that's being followed, and also revalidate the page of the person that's following to update both of those counts. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to do essentially the exact same thing, but I want to do it on a tweet. Whenever I create a tweet, so here on the create section, what I want to do is I want to do some revalidation as well, but I want to get it for the user ID here. So this is just our user ID. So for the user, whenever they create a tweet, revalidate their page as well. Now what I can do is I can come in here and we can do the same thing. We're going to do a get add, we're going to do a commit, and we're going to do a push. And also I'm just going to run this locally so we can make sure hopefully that everything is still working as it was before. So if I refresh my page, give it a quick second here to actually load up, you can see that it is working as we expect, which is great. And I can still do my unfollow and my follow just like I expect. But on the actual production version, once this is finished building, I'll show you the changes, how they work. That just finished loading up, so let's refresh the production version of our site here. Give it a quick second. I'm going to unfollow this user, and then I'm going to also create a new tweet. So we can come over here. Let's make sure we go to the profile, so it's perfectly generated at this point. And let's go log out, log in as that user. Actually, we don't even need to worry about that. We can just log in as the current user we are, because we know the tweet amount is different. So if we go to this page, you can see 0 followers, 0 following. And when I inspect and I view the source, actually not inspect, if I view the source, there we go. And of course, Chrome is yelling at me. I come in here and I search followers. You can see 0 followers right there. That's exactly what we expect. Let's say I follow the user, refresh. There you go. You can see that now it's not giving me that flash anymore. And if I inspect the page source and again, tell Chrome to stop caring, and I just do a line wrap, search for followers, or follower, you can see now it has 1 follower. So it is updating our page. So every single time that we make a change by following or unfollowing a user, it's actually making sure it gets the correct cached version. The first time you hit the page, it's going to give you the wrong version, but every other person that accesses it after that is getting the new revalidated version, which is great. And that's all it takes to create and deploy this Twitter clone. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love some of my other longer TypeScript related projects. I'm going to link them over here. And And with that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.